Cast in the name of God, ye not guilty. Now these iconic opening words are that of 1999's Big O, the iconic series that is dear to my heart and in fact inspired this very channel. Now this is of course a remake of my first retrospective on this channel, back when my production techniques were archaic and I didn't really know what I was quite doing on the editing side of things. Now with my slightly increased editing proficiency, I hope to do this series true justice by remaking my original retrospective and refining it into a love letter into why I think The Big O is one of my favorites and one of the best anime, or at least obscure anime, of the early 2000s. And these iconic words are simply the introduction to a beautiful series which drew me in from the start. Like many other series at the time, The Big O is not necessarily one of the most remembered, even in the time frame of the 1990s and early 2000s. Nor is it often among the breakout superstars of those pioneers, which are widely remembered in the West. Instead, it's often remembered as a quaint and decent series that served as a solid supporter to the lineup of massive pioneers like Dragon Ball, Cowboy Bebop, Evangelion, and so on and so forth. Or some might even see it as the formula of Batman plus giant robots, or if it's remembered at all, a lot of people rag on the ending, which I think is ironically the most beautiful and lovingly crafted part of The Big O. Now, my first experience with the series was the same as it was for many who discovered anime in general in the West. I remembered seeing it on Toonami in my youth and was instantly drawn in by the setup. I remembered staying up late to watch it, although the gap between the production of the first and second seasons always confused me, as did the inconsistency of the broadcast schedule. And while I remembered the show, I never quite remembered all of its depth or its themes as a younger man. And having come back to it, I'm glad that I can reflect on these and try to do the series justice, which of course is one of the points of this retrospective, and one of the points of this channel, in fact, to do justice to obscure art that should be cherished and remembered as much as any other blockbuster of the day. And while The Big O may not be held up to be a pioneer in the same sense as, say, Akira or Ghost in the Shell, it's still a very unique and beautiful piece, and enough so to warrant attention for itself on its own merits. With its stylish settings, cool characters, and of course famous or infamous ending, The Big O is definitely something which can stand on its own and cast its own unique shadow onto the anime landscape around it. With this in mind, I always wondered why it was not held up as highly as many of the series it was running with. What is the true appeal and beauty of The Big O? And having just re-watched it and my old retrospective on the series minutes ago, I can assure you that there is a lot of this series that is beautiful, and I can assure you that it is both very easy and difficult to explain why The Big O is one of the best obscure anime memories that there is out there. Of course, what you take away from the show depends on your own tastes and perspectives to some extent, but there are patterns, ideas, concepts, and characters and feelings which stuck out to me, and I would assume other viewers so much upon another completion of this series. Some of these things are surface level things. I like the cool mech fights and the cool setup of a city of amnesia, while others are deeper and more abstract concepts, like the exploration of what personal truth is and what it is to be human. To truly appreciate the series, though, I think it's necessary to appreciate both its aesthetics and charm, and its deep themes and meanings and character arcs. For this reason, I hope that this exploration of The Big O, while mostly a remake of my previous retrospective, can truly do the series justice. So please join me on Obscure Anime Memories as we start our journey exploring one of my favorite, and in my opinion, one of the best, obscure series out there, The Big O. As with many of these retrospectives, we of course need to start with a brief plot overview of The Big O, in order to both kind of get to know the characters and understand why its ending is so divisive, and a lot of the retrospective afterwards will be dedicated to explaining why I think the ending is actually beautiful and fits very well. To briefly summarize things, The Big O is 26 episodes long and can be broken into several chunks. The first chunk is from episodes 1 to about episode 12, the original first season. These opening episodes start us off on the adventure of The Big O and consist mostly of standalone episodes that, while exploring some important themes and making important character introductions, are for the most part simply to bring us into the world of Paradigm City and bring up important thinking points of the series, as well as introducing some world building moments and getting us to like the characters of The Big O. All of these things are nudging us into suspending our disbelief. These are all enjoyable episodes that fit with the generally slow pace of the series and serve the very important task of getting the viewers to stand behind the characters of the series. Now the next chunk is from episodes 13 to 15, which start to set up the seemingly grander plot. These episodes rapidly introduce concepts like the Union, Gordon Rosewater, Alan Gabriel, and the importance of memories, truths, and making one's own truths. It also introduces many other plot devices that will be resolved later on, though. And this also covers the jump from season 1 to 2, and I feel it's important to note this because the idea of a grander plot was probably seen as somewhat important in order to both rope in new viewers to the series and new funding for the production of a second season. It also explains the different appearances of the show. As you can tell, the second season was done digitally and looks much cleaner, although in my opinion it does lose a bit of its stylistic timeless charm. These episodes are good, but they do throw a lot at the wall, and for this reason some of it may seem muddled, as nothing isn't 100% clearly explained in the Big O until the series' conclusion, and this of course is by design. The third chunk of the plot is from episodes 16 to 19, and this is another batch of standalone episodes. Yet oddly, these are also some of the best episodes of the series. Episode 17 features one of my favorite anime speeches of all time, which says a lot about it, knowing how much this medium loves its speeches. Episode 18 is an excellent comedic episode. The fourth chunk of the series is episodes 20 to 22, which cover the attack of the Union, but don't go as far as the final reveals of the show. This is done in the final chunk, episodes 23 to 26, which serve to answer some of the questions that have been lingering throughout the series, and to accelerate towards the ending of the series. It is this final chunk which is the most divisive, as the series does seem to go off the rails and introduces its very own unique idea. That idea is that the Big O is just a simulated reality, although this has been hinted at since the fourth episode. That is to say that the Big O universe is just some kind of creation or production by Angel, and is really her creation. After this revelation, Roger Smith negotiates with Angel, and she resets the timeline of the Big O so that it can go on a brighter trajectory. And while the reset may seem like a downer or a waste of time, I will explain actually why it's not, and why I think this ending is beautifully in line with a lot of the themes of the series. Now, looking at the plot in its entirety, the main plot of the Big O is basically that Negotiator Roger Smith negotiates settlements between any parties that will accept his services, and this eventually leads him into the deeper rabbit hole of discovering the memories of Paradigm City and helping Angel on her quest to work past whatever it is that bothers her in the real world as the director. Sometimes Roger needs the help of the Big O, the giant mech that he pilots and seems to have some degree of self-awareness. After being joined by android R. Dorothy Wainwright, who quickly becomes the breakout star of the series, Roger is asked to investigate a series of murders in episode 13. This leads to the discovery that the memories of the past actually live on in several people, and that these people are known as tomatoes, and that nefarious forces are seeking to silence these tomatoes. It is eventually revealed that the forces seeking to silence them are the forces of the Union, a vengeful group of exiles, and Alex Rosewater, who wants to wipe away the past in order to recreate society in his own image by employing another big foul. As the Union is defeated by Rosewater in episode 25, he faces off against Roger Smith, who is saved by Dorothy. Before the fight can conclude though, Angel realizes that she is really the director, and that the Big O universe is just her production. Then, in the Big O universe / production, she manifests as the Big Venus, a big with the power to destroy and restart reality. Although, in a literal sense, this is just her, the director, making script rewrites and adjusting her artistic vision. Just as the real life and distraught Angel is about to delete her entire production though, the Big O universe, Roger convinces her not to give up and to simply embrace herself and her own vision. This leads to Big Venus instead restarting the Big O world so that it can go about on a better trajectory than the one it had set upon earlier. You see, this show has two plots. There is the surface plot of finding out the memories and fighting against giant robots, and then there is a subtle one introduced later on, and that is that of Angel the director overcoming whatever it is that seems to greatly trouble her via the use of artistic expression and her own self-insertion into her fictional world. Now, before I get into how the ending made me feel and its implications, I'd like to say that the Big O is more of a character story than a plot story. And in fact, one of the key points of the series is that life itself is a journey and does not have a definite end, i.e. there are no true endings to anything, and everything eventually leads to something else. and this lesson is taught to the viewer in episode 13, which, fittingly enough, was originally supposed to be the last episode of the series as a whole. I'd like to say that the plot of the Big O is actually relatively unimportant, and I think that this is by design. As mentioned earlier, the main plot doesn't even really take up half of the episodes of the series, and seems to be a bit muddled at times. While this is due to both intentional attempts to create mystery and suspense, and unintentional production crunches, I think it's still beautiful for both of these reasons, and actually a strength of sorts. On a practical level, it shows a writing team that was able to work on their feet, and bold enough to create a very unique ending, in spite of the fact that it may not have been completely set up, and in spite of the fact that they were drawing towards that ending at a very rapid pace. In a storytelling sense though, and on a grander level, I think it ties in beautifully into the theme of choosing one's own path. Regardless of whether or not the plot is what it is, what matters is that Roger Smith and the cast grew to make their own choices and to embrace the choices they have made. They embraced who they were as characters and grew so much in their short time, and they grew into their own people. This is shown as early as the 13th episode. Ironically, the first episode of the so-called main plot. In this episode, Gordon Rosewater straight up tells Roger that it is by design that his supposedly prophetic book Metropolis is left unfinished. This is because life has no true endings, and people are always sort of on some kind of journey or character quest. Metropolis cannot be finished because the people of the world have their own agency and lives, and therefore cannot be entirely bowed or cowed by fate or other factors into a predetermined end. Life is about the journey, and not always about the destination, and therefore the ending of the series, as sort of a non-ending, is actually quite in line with the series as a whole. As though it is an ending, it is obvious that the story of Roger Smith, Paradigm City, and life as a whole go on. The first feeling I had at once again completing a rewatch of the Big O was again a bittersweet one. This feeling is what I felt most upon the completion of the Big O and my dwelling on it for an inordinate amount of time. I want to say though that this feeling is nothing to complain about. I just think it is one that we should delve into deeper, as I imagine it is a relatively common one that the series elicits. I do not think that this bittersweet feeling though came from poor planning or writing, but actually as a result of the opposite. This show, while having a charming and endearing character, is not the sunniest. As a neo-noir influenced piece, it does have an air of darkness and sadness, of harsh reality. What I mean by this is that the show is never depressing, but it's never the happiest either. There is a maturity to it, and lots of the characters, and this makes them feel realistic and somewhat serious, or at least by anime standards. One could argue that this is one of the show's strongest points, in fact, that the humanity of these characters makes them so endearing and as real and as serious as characters, or at least anime characters in this context, can be. They come off as realistic people, full of personal growths and conclusions, and I think this is why the ending feels bittersweet. Looking at the ending on the surface, I can understand why some may deem it bad. Since the timeline does reset, and the ending does seem to come out of nowhere if you're not paying close attention, the Big O's ending is kind of weird. Angel just kind of reveals herself to be the director behind the Big O and decides to rewrite it. And as such, while she does reset the timeline, she does not follow the same script as before. She sets it on a brighter trajectory so that things can turn out better. And this distinction is the most important thing to note about the ending. It is not a time loop where the exact events are bound to happen at the exact same times, but a fresh start in which the same characters can undergo brighter futures because the events are not predetermined, because they have been set free from the events that have already happened. It is a clean slate, so to speak, and not a time loop. The time loop idea is where the bitter can come from, as if the timeline is a complete loop, then I would agree that it's bad because it means that all the character growth in the previous 26 episodes repeat ad nauseum and therefore are a waste of everyone's time. If this was the case, there would be no growth and the outcome would always be predetermined. All of the endearing actions and all of the great character moments have been lost, only to be repeated when they come up again in this strict loop. Nothing would stay learned and the viewer would be deprived of the satisfaction of solid character growth or a happy ending. Again though, it's important to note that this is not a loop, and this idea is supported by the fact that the lighting in the ending scene is brighter, and Rogers reaffirms himself alongside the ending title card that says that we have come to terms. And since Angel has come to terms, she's simply resetting things or rewriting things to be a brighter, happier story. The ending title card of We Have Come to Terms best supports this idea that the world will be a better one and not a loop or exact copy of the one that she originally reset. And this is the sweet part. While everyone likes happy endings, they're not always the most realistic, and while I would not complain about one here, I like this ending more as it's so unique and yet also somewhat uplifting. In addition, the show was hinting at it before episode 24, in fact, relatively early on in the series, so I feel like something like this was needed in order to make sure that all of those hints and foreshadowing and images employed earlier go to good use. I also respect how bold it was for the series production team to simply make the show end the way it does, and a non-conclusion of the series ties into the theme of life going onward and there being no true endings. It is a bittersweet ending, but it's also one that is applicable to real life, and thus I feel it makes the show stick with us more as viewers, especially considering how much of a loop it threw many people for, including myself, upon initial watching. Even if the reality of the Big O is a simulated one, however, I still think that the ending has positive implications for both plots though. Creative exploits of one tend to reflect the emotional state of their creator. If one is writing poetry when saddened, the poetry will likely be a little gloomy. If one composes a song while jubilant, it is more likely to have a sound that is triumphant and fun. This is because people tend to use creative ventures as outlets for emotional energy, regardless of their emotional state. Thus, even if the Big O is a simulated environment, the lighter tones and trajectory that it seems to be on post the reset seem to show that Angel herself is on a better trajectory, that she has worked past whatever it is that troubles her, and that she is in a better headspace than she was before. As for the actual surface plot, the ending shows that no matter what the odds or struggle are, or how insignificant that one may think they are in the face of a greater uncaring universe, life does go on. For these reasons, it feels to me that the plot of the Big O is actually genius, as its seeming insignificant marries it perfectly with the significance of themes that we will be exploring later. And I think that the reset is not a throwaway loop, but in fact that it beautifully ties everything together. I think the plot is actually one of the reasons I love this show, and unfortunately one of the reasons many others seem to loathe the ending. Although as the themes of the show and the characters are the main strengths of the series, I feel that the plot putting itself under them is a beautiful way of its actually supporting them and make sure that we focus on the right aspects of the series. And I think it speaks to the show's unique character and beauty. On the topic of beauty though, The Big O is actually a very beautiful series in and of itself from a visual aspect. Now in the first part I mentioned how the characters and themes of The Big O are more important than the plot itself, and I do stand by this. One of the reasons I do is because how prominently they stick out among the setting itself. In fact, the setting and execution of the Big O are enough to set it apart on its own. This show has made quite a name for itself as a pioneering noir anime, and that while dystopian, was so in such a very unique and beautiful way. While most dystopian settings are set in the future, like say Akira or Ghost in the Shell, Big O is set in a setting which oozes the past. While the former works can create discomfort and unease through the acknowledgement that this could happen, at least there is a sort of possibility that one can reflect on the good old days, or say that, well, it's not set in stone. The viewer is not as uncomfortable as they could be because they know that this is a potential future and not the future. While the technology of the Big O is more advanced than what we currently have though, at least in terms of giant robots, its settings and styles and mannerisms are all undeniably set in the past. This in turn strips away a lot of the comfort that the viewer might have from the idea that this is a possible future. Since it is something that feels like it's set in the past, it feels like we're watching a past event, something that has already happened, and yet we're unsure what this event is. All of this makes it seem like the timeline cannot be altered in any way, and in turn makes us feel small. While Ghost in the Shell and other dystopian series can create uncertainty for the viewer and characters because the cast does not know what the future holds, and they're uneasy over this, the Big O is unique in that the cast is more focused and bothered by the lack of a past. After all, waking up and not knowing who you are is just as frightening as waking up not knowing if you're going to be the same person tomorrow. In both cases, temporal issues force the characters into a constant questioning of who they are and what they want in life. In that way, the Big O's unique setting makes it much more tense than anything set in the future. Since everything feels like a past event, it feels like everything is already predetermined, whether or not the day will be saved. It feeds into the uncertainty of the amnesia trope, and in turn creates a sort of ticking clock element. It's a beautiful reversal of the trope of the uncertain and frightening future. It makes the viewer feel like they're cut off, and it makes them feel like there is a pressure to learn everything without really knowing why though. In a sense, the Big O just kind of transcends time, and the setting is a very big part of this, as setting the series in a city of amnesia, in combination with older film tropes and newer technology, as well as being animated, gives the show a very timeless noir feel. In line with this timeless feeling is how the Big O takes the noir trope of the amnesia to the extreme by setting the story in a city of amnesia, that being Paradigm City. Now, the city is called the City of Amnesia because of the large individual and collective memory fog, which goes back about 40 years. That is to say that no one can recall anything which happened before 40 years. Everything before that is seemingly lost to a miasma of lost memories. All that is known is that this memory fog was created by some sort of great cataclysm, and well, really, that's about it. The lack of a past is a common point in the show, in fact, and its moral implications will be explored more later. On a more grounded level, Paradigm City itself is a city bearing more than a passing resemblance to New York. In fact, just look at some of these photos and shots. It's set up as the last bastion of humanity in a post-apocalyptic wasteland, and like actual New York, the city itself is very uneven. Parts of it are beautiful haunts of the rich and famous, wealthy estates where the inhabitants live in the lap of luxury. Wealthier areas tend to be under domes, and thus are referred to as, the domes. Other areas are hard-scrabbled slums inhabited by the desperate, barely eking out an existence. Beyond these areas at the heart of the city, though, there are a few outlying farming areas and settlements on the fringes of Paradigm, and past those are an endless sea of sand and desolation, eventually terminating at an ocean. At the head of everything, though, is the Paradigm Corporation, run by a ruthless Alex Rosewater, who by extension controls the city and its police. Now, I cannot emphasize how stylish the city of Paradigm City itself is, and it's obvious that a noir look and sound was set upon from the start. The streets all look worn, and even the nicer parts look like something from the 1930s. There are speakeasies and steamy alleys, run-down tenements, and ritzy nightclubs featuring piano acts. And the color palette is mostly dark as well, although it does have some unique splashes of color, lending a kind of fantastical Art Deco feeling to the series or some scenes. All of this mesh together very well and feed into the extremely stylized look of the series, along with dimmer lighting and some beautiful low-angle shots conveying the oppressive feel of the city. Sleek shots like this, well, they just make you feel. All of this, of course, is backed up by an original soundtrack oozing character. It is part orchestral, part funk, part jazz, and a lot of epic anime brass for those great mech fights. It's all around amazing, and used very fittingly. For example, when the mystery of the series is played up, you might hear the bells of the song Weep 4. When Dorothy is having a sassy moment with Roger, you might hear something warm and cozy, like nature. And of course, the mech fights are always backed up by some sort of inspiring brass, like Sure Promise. And these brass pieces especially get to me, and I love the original soundtrack as a whole to this series, as the imagery and music of the production really get us into the world of the Big O and help us ingrain ourselves in and get closer to the characters and world. Especially helpful to this process are how well certain settings are made to suit certain characters. Look at this shot, for example. This is Schwartzwald's room. Look how well it describes him. Look how it sells you on him. Immediately, you can tell that this is a residence of a man on a mission. And probably some sort of lung disease. All of the cluster and clutter shows that he is obsessed on his quest for the truth, that he is set on some kind of certain goal, that he is on a mission. But the fact that it's neatly organized also shows that this is a man of method, and logic, and intelligence, and not just some random impulse. He is obsessive and consumed by his desire, but he's also smart and has a process of sorts. I also love how the typewriter is named Another Light, showing how Schwartzwald wants to enlighten the masses with his work and sees the dissemination of knowledge as critical. Here is another example of the setting up a character. Now this is Alex Rosewater, the head of Paradigm, and an antagonistic force throughout the series. Now this is the main haunt of Big Al, the Paradigm Dome, and executive offices. Note how the monumental architecture and inspiring scope and scale of the building mirror the kind of imposing presence that Rosewater himself wants to convey. Note the religious imagery. In fact, a lot of the building is seemingly a resemblance to the biblical Tower of Babel, and there are many paintings which hint at some kind of religious ideas here. It should also be noted that at the building's top is Rosewater's offices, and this is to let you know that he's on top. This, without literally saying anything, lets you know that there is a powerful man here, that there is a man with some kind of complex here, and he wants you to know that he's in charge. He wants you to know that he is mean, and that he is dominant. That he is the guy, and he wants you to know that his word is law. Even a lot of minor characters, though, have setting that helps set them up. This is Big Ear, a supporting character and Roger's main informant, and he knows things. As such, he likes to keep a low profile and get the job done as unassumingly as possible. And his setting, this simple bar table, speaks perfectly to this. Notice how out of the way it is, and how it's against a wall. Notice how inconspicuous it is. And it speaks of a man simply trying to stay in the background and just keep his ears open to the happenings around him. Finally, let's look at a cool inverse of this, the case of Angel. Now you're probably thinking, Angel doesn't really have a unique setting associated with her, and I think that's exactly the point. In fact, she's the only character not to have a setting associated with her. Schwartzwald has his apartment, Rosewater has the Prodigal offices, Roger has his mansion, Dan Datsun has his office, and even Big Ear has his bar table. And there are so many other locations setting up so many other characters so well, often as soon as they're introduced. However, there is no setting which really sets up Angel. And I think that this is intentional. When we see Schwartzwald's apartment, we instantly know this guy's obsessed. When we see Big Ear's table, we know that this guy likes to keep a low profile. And when we see Paradigm, Dome, and offices, we know that this guy is dominant. But Angel doesn't really have a setting which does any kind of defining of her character, and this in turn lends her character a lot of mystery. She does not really seem to have a space of her own, and this in turn makes the viewer question more about her and who she really is. Denying her a setting denies her of a lot of context, making her more intriguing and interesting. And it also speaks to the fluid and unsure nature of her character, as nothing is, quite literally, set in stone. The setting even sets up the final twist of the series, and in fact acts as one of the strongest forces in doing so. Note the model city in episode 4. Note the weird and out-of-place underground stylings, of below the subway of course. Note the blatant giveaways in the final episodes before the final 2 episodes. Even the name of the city speaks to this, as Paradigm City literally means model and or theoretical city. And this model city is where the model of a great mech anime is set, and this mech anime is one greatly assisted by its strong setting. A setting which is one of the strongest points of the series and works overtime to integrate and inform the viewer about the amazing series that they have just started. And that leads us to a brief aside about the art and the performances of the Big O. Now, when I did my first retrospective, I never really touched on either the voice acting or the artistic execution in general, and seeing as that I do that in all my other retrospectives now, that was kind of an oversight. But that's why we come back to touch these things up. Anyways, starting with the art style of the Big O, while I have talked about how it is an Art Deco noir inspired piece, when it comes to the actual execution of everything, like how stuff is drawn on the screen, it's varied. There is a hard divide between season 1 and 2 in terms of quality. Season 2, very touched up, everything looks the way it's supposed to, and it's done digitally and is just generally a lot more cleaner. Compared to this, season 1 feels almost like an experimental art piece, in that a lot of the characters don't necessarily look superhuman in some shots, but I don't know if that's either because of budgetary issues or some kind of artistic statement. Maybe they were going for some kind of Art Deco humans to go with their noir-inspired piece. I don't know if that's true or not, but I always kind of liked how in Season 1 a lot of the people are kind of janky or weird, because it never really ruined the immersion for me. It just kind of reminded me that this is a piece that has its own artistic vision, and sometimes that artistic vision had to come in on a very small budget. There is one curious holdover, though, between the transition from Season 1 to 2, and that is the fingers. Now, for some reason, the characters in the Big O have very, I don't want to say Talon-like, but angular fingers. And with the first season, this kind of made sense. They're going for a little bit of a rougher look. There's less quality control. I mean, look at the many faces of Alex Rosewater, for example. And it made sense in that context. It's something that was fine. But I think they decided to keep it for Season 2 as just either a form of continuity or because hands really are that difficult to draw. Again, this never really bothered me, but I just think it's a neat little visual detail that connects the two series in a visual sense. Because in a visual sense, they are very different from Season 1 to 2. There's obviously a massive scaling up of the resources that went into the production of the second season. It is a lot cleaner, and it looks marvelous. Although I will say that all the jank in season 1 and its hand-drawn, kind of almost low-budget feel have a very special place in my heart, and I like both. If the entire show was done in the style of season 1 or the entire style of season 2, it would have been great, either one. However, seeing as that half the show is done in one style and half in the other, it adds a kind of a unique aspect to the visuals of the Big O. Now, getting to the voice performances, I don't know why I didn't go over this in the original retrospective. I considered it, but I didn't. But the dubbing for the Big O is one of the best casts I've seen in any anime. I mean, the Big O, for a piece that's not very well known, has an all-star English cast. I don't know how popular the Japanese actors are because I don't know, honestly. But the English cast for this is superb. We have Steve Blum, Spike Spiegel himself, playing Roger Smith. And while you can tell, it is distinctly enough to give Roger his own vocal identity. In addition, his general delivery is Roger Smith and not Spike Spiegel. It's just a very good use of Mr. Blum's voice talents, as the Roger Smith voice is a very nice, very commanding, but warm enough and empathetic enough voice to give feeling and presence to the Negotiator himself. Next up is Leah Sargent, who voices Dorothy, and she does a very good job of playing a robotic character. We're not talking about Data Brett Spiner robot who's basically human. We're talking about someone who, from a physiological point and from the point of the actual vocal tones used, is extremely robotic. Now, Dorothy is very human, and her entire arc is about proving her humanity, essentially, but in terms of physical delivery, Leah Sargent does a very good job of using a generally kind of flat delivery, but it's not boring. It's very obvious that there is feeling here, but that it's delivered from an android who probably physically cannot necessarily differentiate tone very much. It is a very interesting but memorable monotone performance, which is weird because Dorothy kind of has one tone throughout the series, even though she has many emotions throughout the series. They're all kind of delivered in a very similar tone, and yet Leah Sargent's delivery is excellent enough to the point where you can tell the different emotions from the same tone. And it just goes with her sarcastic scenes very well as well. Next up, we have the voice of Angel, Wendy Lee, and her deliveries in this are no exception to her excellent body of work. Angel's delivery adds a nice counterpoint to Dorothy's a lot of time, where Dorothy is monotone, Angel is often a little over the top sometimes, and it is great seeing all the emotions that go into her voice acting. And that gets us to Alex Rosewater, who's voiced by Michael Forrest. I think of everyone in this show, Michael Forrest has probably been in the most stuff. I mean, he was in an episode of Star Trek, for God's sakes, which is a hallmark of success. His performance of Alex Rosewater does a very good job instilling a very commanding presence to the character, and yet he has enough emotional range to make it apparent when Alex Rosewater is suffering from a moment of insecurity, and to make these moments of insecurity seem very genuine and apparent to the viewer. Overall, a very good performance of a very pompous and yet insecure man. There is the main character of this channel at this point, Michael McConaughey. Now, looking back at some of my other videos, I realized that I said McConaughey, but I think it's actually McConaughey looking at the spelling. But regardless, I said it, and every time I mention this guy, he has probably one of the best voice actor voices of all time. I love his performance and everything he's in. And they gave him, the man with the best voice, some of the best moments of reading in the series, because he voices Schwartzwald, and his commanding voice does a good job giving a very commanding presence to all of the things that Schwartzwald says. While Schwartzwald is a delusional and passionate man, there is primal fury in him, but one that is controlled by his logical sensibilities. And this is perfectly encapsulated by Michael McConaughey's delivery. It's deep enough and powerful enough to let us know that this guy is someone who's serious about what he says, but it's emotional enough to let us know that he's not quite based in reality, or that he's not quite entirely here. That and the fact that Michael McConaughey's voice is good in basically any context, and there you go. Excellent voice actor with an excellent voice, with excellent dialogue that fits the character of Schwartzwald basically perfectly. However, that's not to say that the minor characters don't have great voice acting either. In fact, there are still many more big names that play minor characters. William Frederick Knight does the voice of Gordon Rosewater, and now while that name might not sound the most familiar, if you've watched an anime dub and you've heard the old man voice, you know who this guy is. He did the voice of Aramaki, of director Aramaki in Ghost in the Shell standalone complex, and has showed up in many pieces as Old Man, or character who is an old man. And the voice is also very fitting for Gordon Rosewater here. In addition, Crispin Freeman does the voice of Alan Gabriel, and this guy has also been in a lot of things, most notably in my book doing the voice of Togusa for Ghost in the Shell standalone complex. Finally, I'd like to mention Jameson Price as the voice of Big Ear, and Peter Lorre as the voice of Dan Datsun. These guys are also guys who have played a lot of smaller roles over their careers, and lent their vocal talents to many pieces, like the Big O, where they both do very good jobs giving a very defined character, a very good sound and voice to their characters. Overall, I find it extremely ironic that the Big O, a series that was never that popular, has almost every single character voiced by either a relatively big name in the dubbing industry or one of very high quality. It's hilarious to me because the Big O was never that big, but they really got some big talent to do all the voices here. Now that we've looked at the plot and setting of the Big O, it's time we look at what I said was the most important part of this series, and that is the characters. Now, Big O is a character story at its core, and for that reason, I think they're very important to the show. To start, I would like to look at the character of Schwartzwald, whom I held to be the most interesting. Although not the main character of the series, his views and speeches and design reel the viewer in from his very first presence, even if he only does appear or is mentioned in about a third of the episodes of the series. Schwartzwald is the one which stuck with me the most, and as such is the one I'd like to speak on first, especially since his views on the truth do a good job of establishing some of the broader themes of the series that will be touched on throughout this retrospective. His character is one of obsession, one of passion, yet also one of isolation and delusion, spite and fury, yet wisdom and some kind of twisted love or at least respect for humanity. Schwartzwald is the character which opens the eyes of the viewer and the characters of the show, and get us to embrace a wider questioning of everything around us. Now, just as a disclaimer before we get into things, I will say that the word truth will be thrown a lot here and throughout the retrospective, as it is a big part of the series, and I need to explain what I mean when I say truth. Now, truth and fact are not necessarily the same. They can be, but since truth is a more subjective and personal thing, it's a lot more nuanced, as truth can mean anything on a wide spectrum. It can mean the main reason for existing, or it can be a simple fact. It can be interpreted in a literal sense, or it can be interpreted in a more metaphysical and abstract one. Take, for example, the truth of owing someone $5 versus the truth of God or existence. One of these things is a factual statement. The other one is a much more nebulous concept that you need to come to your own conclusions on. As I will state throughout this retrospective, the Big O has a nebulous take on the truth, although it does blatantly state that there are many truths out there and we must all seek and establish our own. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. First, we need to understand Schwartzwald's place in the plot if we want to understand his character. Schwartzwald first appears in episode 4 and is introduced as an obsessive reporter whom Paradigm wants to fire because of his obsessive quest for the truth. What he obsesses over is the events of what happened 40 years ago, and this makes Paradigm very uncomfortable. They don't want him sniffing around sensitive issues and stirring up the masses. Anyways, in his first appearance, Schwartzwald leads Roger to the underground model city, wakes up the archetype, a prototype Big, and gets himself set on fire. He next appears in episode 12, where he is revealed to be alive, and now with Big Duo, the Flying Big, teams up to destroy Paradigm Corporation and inspire the people to think for themselves by scaring them into doing so. In his attempt to do so, however, he wrecks a good part of the dome, sets multiple bystanders on fire, and causes massive property damage. As such, Roger sees it necessary to stop him alongside Big O, as they simply seek to protect the people from Schwartzwald's violent and misguided attempts to spread the truth and thinking. Schwartzwald next appears in episode 17, where he gives the famous Leviathan speech, one of the best anime speeches of all time. In this speech, he pleads with the people to think, saying that if they don't, they will simply apathetically await execution and eventually death, that they will stagnate and die, and that as such it is his duty to scare them into thinking, as if they won't do so themselves, well, someone's gotta get them thinking. Finally, Schwartzwald makes an appearance in spectral form in episode 24, where he, as a ghost, proceeds over the condemnation of Alan Gabriel, who has taken over Big Duo. Other than these episodes, Schwartzwald of course has various cameos and references made to him throughout the series. Now usually in many anime set in the future, That's just it. The show is just set in the future, and in fact the setting of many series is just that, the setting. Some world building is done, and everyone, characters and viewer included, accept the setting for what it is and get on with the plot. Schwartzwald, however, is the first to really hint that there is more to this world than there initially seems, though, that the world itself is a lie, and that there's more to the Big O than just the quest for the memories, that this is kind of a meta-commentary on the creative process itself and the ideas of fundamental truths that we all hold, and that there are fundamental truths present. Schwartzwald wants the viewer and the characters to know that they simply cannot take things at face value, and he's kind of a white rabbit that gets us started on the quest to discover the real truth of the Big O universe. He is the spark which lights the flame of curiosity, asking, is everything really how it seems? Who controls what? Who are we? And what is truth? And his constant questioning eventually drives Roger, and in turn the viewer, to question the status quo, and eventually come to their own conclusions. In his eyes, think. This is him forcing everyone to evolve in his own words. But why is this important, and what is evolution in his eyes? And why do people need to evolve in his eyes? Well, for Schwartzwald, the answer is obvious. Evolution is knowing, and people need to know so that they can further their own development, because not doing so is stagnation, and stagnation can become de-evolution, which can slide into weakening and eventually death. For a man of such drive, the idea that others lack or cannot harness a similar drive is incomprehensible. His idea is that if he evolves constantly, he can evade death. He lives in a sort of fear of death, in fact, and he thinks that if all people are roughly equal and capable of every thought that he has conjured up, why can't they embrace his thoughts? If people are capable of reasoning, and Schwartzwald bases all of his conclusions on reasoning, even if it is his own unconventional reasoning, then why can't others come to the same conclusions that he has? It would seem to Schwartzwald that they should, and since they don't, he figures that they're stagnating and therefore dying, barely even human at this point. He loathes the decadence that people have sunken into, which has blinded them from seeking the truth. As to him, the truth should be sought above all else in his eyes. And not seeking it, in fact doing literally anything else, is stagnating, something which terrifies him, as it is something which he sees as one step above death. For this reason, he embarks on his quest to, quote, restore humanity to the masses by first simply attempting to inform them and later scaring them into thinking. Since in his eyes, thinking will save humanity, any means to get them to think is therefore justified, and as a result, he doesn't tend to hold individual life or property in the highest regard and gets more violent over time. This twisted view of humanity in turn serves to fuel Schwartzwald's delusional quest to enlighten the masses and himself. Someone must save the species after all, and, if he's the only one capable of doing so, well then, it's gotta be him. His quest for truth and spreading it have tangled with his obsessive and Darwinist views, and this creates a man who loves humanity for its potential, but also seems to loathe it for its failures to always live up to said potential. This contrast explains both how he can try to rally and save the people with dynamic speeches, yet also how he can see humanity as pitiful and resort to heinous violence in order to spread his message, that being of think. This conflicted view of humanity even extends to himself. Schwartzwald is many things, but it cannot be said that he does not apply his own views to himself. He truly believes what he preaches, and as such constantly pushes himself to think. Think of how to find the truth, think of what that truth may be, and think of how to spread it. Think of how to awaken the masses, and think of how to continue evolving. While he does not hold the safety of the common man in the highest regard, he doesn't seem to hold his own safety in high regard either, as noted by his constant exposure to flames, giant robot fights, and other occupational hazards. Over time, his quest for the truth itself evolves, going from seeking a simple timeline to seeking to understand his place in the universe and the agents and powers of God controlled by man, i.e. the Bigs. As such, his views start to take on a sort of pseudo-religious tone, as if Big Duo is a sort of divine or pseudo-divine presence, and it has accepted Schwartzwald as its pilot, then that means that Schwartzwald now also has some kind of bizarre divine or pseudo-divine presence. For this reason, the definition of truth to him becomes slightly more nebulous, although still is a bit restrictive. For example, he's accepted that there is more to the world than a simple timeline and humanity, but he still doesn't really care about the abundant small truths around him, like the truth of the love a family has for its members, or of simple human interaction. He seems to hold that the universe is just a sort of cold and infinite presence, and that humanity needs to think in order to evolve and in turn survive it. He has become some sort of twisted apostle, a man on a mission to understand this nebulous higher power in any way possible and tell the masses of it, or at least inspire them to think about it for their own sake. And this image of a twisted apostle is what I find most fascinating about Schwartzwald. He is a sort of broken inverse to the idea of a conventional prophet. Where a prophet tells of God, Schwartzwald tells of the idea of some kind of higher thing. Where a prophet is sought out by a god they know of, Schwartzwald tries to seek out a god he doesn't even know exists or can define. Where a prophet tries to give the masses help through preaching, Schwartzwald tries to help himself by preaching to the masses. Where prophets tell people of truths, Schwartzwald tells people to help him find their own truths. Both, however, tell of the idea that there is a deeper and higher truth to things, that there are higher powers present, and that people need to rise to whatever the occasion may be. And I think the most telling proof for the idea of Schwartzwald being some kind of heretical prophet is, oddly enough, in the original soundtrack. His theme is called Stoning, and I think this is appropriate for his character. Heretics are, after all, stoned, and heretics are someone who question established doctrine. Heretics also try to establish their own doctrine and spread it and the questioning of established doctrine to the masses. And in a land where amnesia is the accepted norm, someone who longs exclusively for the memories of the past is heretical. That is not to say that his search for truth in and of itself is wrong, though, even if his methods pursuing it are. Every view is heretical to some other view in some way when we think about it, and it just happens that Schwartzwald's views are heretical to the views of Paradigm City. It just so happens that Schwartzwald has a different set of views and wants to shift the perception of the people. He wants to convince them that the search for truth is good, and that we should all partake in it. I do not think it coincidence that Schwartzwald has a flame motif, for flame illuminates and cleanses, yet it's also extremely destructive and hard to control. This fits Schwartzwald perfectly, as the truth can also illuminate, but it can also be hard to control, and it can be frightening at times. On one hand, Schwartzwald is obsessed with enlightening the masses and cleansing them of their decadence and ignorance. Yet on the other hand, the methods he employs are extremely dangerous to everyone including himself, and it's obvious that he's not completely in control of himself or his actions. What is this truth he seeks, however, though, and how does Schwartzwald's quest for it impact him? As discussed earlier, the Big O gives the answer that the truth can really be a lot of things and it depends on the individual. There is many truths present, and many can be present at the same time and true to different extents to different people, big or small, and that it's up to us to seek our own. In fact, this is directly stated by Roger. This view, however, is one which contradicts Schwartzwald and can be seen as a critical character flaw of his. The search for the greatest truth has blinded him to the myriad of truths around him, and as a result, he has become pig-headed and developed a sort of savior complex. He is trying to open his eyes so wide to the greatest possible picture that he's blinded to all of the beautiful small pictures around him, that he's blinded to the small truths of the many individuals in Paradigm City. He is blind to the fact that his methods are not the most morally upstanding, and he's blind to the pain that he's causing to himself and others. While prophets are appointed by God and given sight, Schwartzwald has attempted to crown himself a prophet and in turn lost his own sight, the sight of those around him and of himself. He's cut off his family, forsaken his home, and has even become a sort of pariah, all so that he can find the truth, and in turn, he's lost the true love of those around him, and the sight of many small truths which make our lives enjoyable. He has been consumed by his work and obsessive tendencies, and he has discarded everything that he has known, all to try and learn something he may never fully be able to. While prophets know that God and everything that there is cannot realistically be comprehended, as it is beyond our comprehension, the heretical one here is consumed by trying to prove otherwise. Ironically, while Schwartzwald says people need to think to avoid death, he himself has effectively killed his old identity via obsessive thought. Schwartzwald's drive for knowledge, though, does not mean that he has a god complex. In fact, I would say that it means the opposite. Schwartzwald wants to know the truth so that he can be closer to fulfilling whatever part of the greater picture he thinks that he needs to fulfill. This part of him is the part of everyone that longs for certainty, to fulfill his assigned role of informing the masses. Even if the truth he seeks is not bluntly expressed as a god, Schwartzwald holds it as some kind of nebulous higher power not to be trifled with. He doesn't really seem the religious type, but he does know that humans are not the be-all, end-all, and that whatever power is above them should be respected and revered, even if he doesn't quite know what that power is. This is proven by two key interactions. First, it's shown by the fact that Big Duo, whom he acknowledges as some kind of higher power, the power of God created by man, respects him and even tries to help him carry out his mission after Schwartzwald is forced out in episode 12. Second, in episode 24, Big Duo flies up after condemning Alan Gabriel and flies up high enough to finally let Schwartzwald see the big picture, that the Big O universe is just some kind of production. This is some kind of divine or karmic reward, it would seem, for Schwartzwald knowing his place, and attempting, even if in an extremely twisted manner, to help enlighten his fellow man. This final reveal of the truth of Paradigm to Schwartzwald even seems to give him some kind of twisted closure, as now he knows the truth as it is. He appoints himself a prophet so that he can experience and familiarize himself with a higher power, whatever that higher power or truth may be. In his eyes, he simply refers to this as the truth. That's not to say that he supports or preaches the definite idea of some kind of god or institution, or that there's even a concrete doctrine that he follows, but that he simply acknowledges that there is something beyond humanity, and that people need to understand this and know their place in the universe, whatever that place may be. He doesn't define any of these things, what someone's place should be or what higher powers lurk above humanity. He simply knows that there is more that he can't comprehend, and that these things should be respected. He does not seek to play God, and this reverence in turn reflects upon a notion of the show that people need some kind of higher context in order to frame their lives in, whether it be religion, or mythology, or history, or even extended family and tribal ties. People need some sort of greater context to frame their lives in order to fulfill the part of them which craves certainty, that craves answers, and craves truth. For Schwartzwald, this higher notion is truth itself, even if in a rather vague and nebulous form, and that is why he seeks it. I would also say that's why Big Duo deems him not guilty. It recognizes that Schwartzwald doesn't necessarily seek to serve himself, but a higher power of sorts. He seeks to somehow enlighten the masses and serve the greater good by informing them of whatever truth may be. I also think that this is why Big Duo allows him to pilot it, and why it's also Schwartzwald who proceeds over the condemnation of Alan Gabriel, as their views are almost the complete inverse. Schwartzwald shuns himself and the material world to seek the truth, while Alan Gabriel shuns the truth to seek the material world and himself. One wants to do everything they can to find the truth, while one does everything they can in order to deny the truth and impose their own nihilistic views on the world. In the end, all of the actions of the heretical prophet were to find the truth. And, in some twisted way, he was true to himself the whole time. And having talked about Schwartzwald, the man of the truth, I think it's time we talk about his exact mere opposite, and that being Alan Gabriel. Now, while Alan Gabriel was probably the least significant character that I will dedicate a portion of this video to, this image of inverses really inspired me to tackle him next, and this is because Schwartzwald is the one who puts the truth above all, while Alan is the one who says that the truth is literally nothing and puts everything, especially himself, before the truth. In this way, he does add a lot to the show, even if he doesn't actually do that much in terms of plot relevance, as while he does seem rather unimportant, he does do an important task conveying some of the themes that Schwartzwald does, just from the opposite direction. And this in turn ties him very well to the main threads and fabric of the show itself, and establish him as a character that, while seemingly insignificant, is important for the time he is on screen. Who is this inverse, however, though? Who is this Alan Gabriel? Alan Gabriel is a mysterious assassin who first appears in episode 15. In this episode, he shows up near the end of the episode, shoots an old man, and then proceeds to steal his compact disc memories. This establishes Alan as a psychopathic killer who works for whoever will benefit him the most. He hates androids, even though he is half android, and this sets the tone for the rest of his appearances. He does make appearances in many episodes after this, although his most important appearances are in episode 20, where he tries to kill Dorothy, hating her because she's an android, establishing her own humanity, and establishing himself as a Union agent, though of especially dubious loyalty, who later defects to Rosewater in exchange for Big Duo. His second important appearance is in episode 24, where Big Duo, whom Alan has taken over, extracts retribution upon Mr. Gabriel for his denial of the existence of a truth and his arrogance. In terms of plot significance, Alan serves to create an extra threat to the main cast and spice up the Union threat a bit, but that's about it in terms of material impact. However, as the plot of the show isn't the most important thing in it, Alan's plot impact is also not the most important part of his character. Alan serves other, more important purposes, and his character is an interesting and mysterious one for this reason. Now, I think it is rather intentional that a lot of his backstory isn't fleshed out because A, he denies the past having any importance, B, he denies the truth even existing, and C, they were under a time crunch. They didn't have time to really flesh that out if we're looking at this from a pragmatic point of view. But that doesn't matter because all of this is in line with his character of being one that lets his actions do all of the talking, all of which rather crass. While most characters in the Big O seem to be bothered by their lack of knowledge or the true events of what happened 40 years ago, they are all open to learning it and developing their own personal ideas and takeaways and moving about life in their own newly established context. Alan, though, always seems to be having the time of his life. In fact, he's probably the least distressed character we see for the majority of his on-screen appearances. It is also notable, though, that of all the characters, he's also the only one that denies there being any kind of larger purpose or goal or truth, as he puts it. He even claims that this doesn't exist, and as a violent nihilist, he relishes in this point. He only seeks to destroy, and he doesn't do this to spread some grand idea or enforce some greater point, or even because he cares about the job he's been paid to do, but purely because he can. He wants to spread as much chaos and do as much damage as possible in as many ways as possible, and just because he can. There is no reason to do so in his eyes, however, there's also no reason not to in his eyes. Where the main flaw of Schwartzwald was that he wanted to know everything, and as a result tried to zoom out way too much in order to see the whole picture, Alan Gabriel cares to know nothing about anything, and consequently zooms all the way in on himself, which is just as grievous as a flaw, as we'll see, as it does lead to his downfall. All of this sets up Alan as the ultimate foil to Schwartzwald and an important part of the cast, as he is the sole character to state that there is no truth, that there's no point to anything, and he doesn't really seem to care about any grander ideas even if they should be proven to exist. He states that there's no real point to anything other than oneself. And while some characters are ambivalent to learning the truth of 40 years ago, or they may seek to mold it themselves, they all have some kind of higher purpose or goal or motivating factors or something that adds an element to them which supersedes them and motivates them to do what they do, to add some greater context to their lives and actions. It could be a professional thing like how Dan Datsun seeks to keep order, or it could be some deep personal thing like Roger seeking to protect the people of Paradigm out of good morality or good wills. It could even be something more big and grandiose, like how Alex Rosewater wants to recreate society. The point is that every other character in the Big O has some kind of greater purpose or goal, or at least job that they're working towards. Alan is the sole character to say that there is none, and even if there was, it wouldn't matter, there's no point to anything, just focus on yourself. Because that's what he's doing, he's focusing entirely on himself and enjoying himself. And he serves as the show's response to those questioning the idea of needing a truth or higher purpose or some kind of goal or responsibility. If Alan was not around, the viewer would have no answer to the very reasonable questions of, do I need a truth? Is the truth real? Why should I care about it if it is real? And Alan's presence serves to answer all of these questions in a way congruent with the themes of having one's own truth. And as a foil to Schwartzwald, he allows the show to come to many of the same conclusions that Schwartzwald does, but from very different angles. Now, to answer the first question, why would people need a truth, Alan proves that this is important and how his character just lacks a deeper point. And what I mean by this is that not only does his character lack a lot of plot significance, but it also lacks substantial motivations and human elements to it. All there really is a psychotic desire and psychotic tendencies. There's no sweeping vision or Trieste or even love of oneself. He doesn't even really seem to be a narcissist so much as a nihilist. He has no great cause or even motivation, really. kind of hangs around and does his own thing. There is no point to him other than meeting his very shallow goals of violence and destruction. There is no point to him other than him. And he even seems to be tacitly aware of this in some scenes. Alan is the ultimate shallow character, and this is by intention. His character is shallow because his views mean that he can't really grow as a character. He's limiting himself by not having some kind of big purpose or goal, and he's just simply a shell of a man as a result. Perhaps this even explains why he hates androids, because ironically, even they have their own goals and truths and are thus more human than he is, even if not in a literal sense. As noted earlier, truth in this context could mean anything which people seek to give greater context to their lives or greater meaning to their lives. However, by denying the goal, Alan is denying the reasons for the goal, and as such, he's denying himself opportunities to grow. The point here is that everyone needs some kind of goal to push themselves forward. Schwartzwald proclaims this in his thinking speech, where he claims that people that don't evolve stagnate, and Alan has become a kind of psychotic caricature of stagnation. Yes, he does have superhuman powers, and yes, he does seem to be having the time of his life, but if we really look at Alan the first time we see him and compare him to the second time we see him, he's basically the same guy. He doesn't have an arc, he doesn't really grow, he's stagnant. And ironically, this does kind of sort of cause his death, because it leads to a sense of arrogance that does get him killed. So Alan's character arc, if you could call it that, kind of proves one of Schwartzwald's point to some extent. And it's a great example of how the two characters work off of each other pretty well. He has discarded the context with which to frame his aspirations, and as such his aspirations have really boiled down to a puddle of psychotic violence. Alan Gabriel is a twisted and nihilistic jester of a man, and just a caricature of someone who wants to burn everything for fire's sake. Now, to answer the second question of, is truth real? Again, that's a portion of the video we'll get to later, but to keep things short, the Big O states that there's many truths, and that many may be correct in certain ways at certain times, according to certain people. It is, though, up to the individual to choose whatever they want to pursue, or at least believe. Alan is unique, though, in the cast, in that he seeks to embrace and employ no truth beyond himself, and this is why he's punished so directly by Big Duo. While Big Foul disobeys Alex Rosewater until he hijacks it using Dorothy's memory, it's important to note that Big Foul does not outright kill Mr. Rosewater or deem him guilty. It just deems him not. That is not worthy. However, Alan Gabriel is directly killed by Big Duo because he is deemed guilty. And this is because he has put himself above all, and because he doesn't really see the need for any kind of greater context. Alex Rosewater is a horrible narcissist, yes. A horrible person, yes. But he does have some kind of reason d'etre which extends beyond himself, even if it's not necessarily a good one. He still has human moments, he's proud, and he's dominant. And he even cries after seemingly killing his father. He is still a human being, even if an unlikable one. He is still developing, even if for the worse. And he is still pursuing some kind of bigger objective, even if it's an ugly one. He is still recognized as a human, even if not the best one. Alan, on the other hand, sinks so far into his nihilistic passion for wanton violence and destruction that it has stripped him of his last bastion of humanity. He has renounced his humanity in order to ascend to whatever state he claims to be, and this unchecked arrogance, driven by a lack of purpose, has driven him to his own death. He has denied truth to himself, and has attempted to become the sole arbiter of this or something to others. As such, he's tried to play God, and for trying to fly too high too much, he has paid the price via the divine retribution dealt out by Big Duo. A scene which is overseen by Schwartzwald. Again, a nice little link between the two characters. This series of events proves that there is A, some kind of higher power above humans, if not necessarily God or institution or even really defined in the Big O. And B, growth is really difficult if someone doesn't try to attempt to do something. A greater goal or truth can inspire people to greatness, and it can hold them back from folly. It can lead people to pursue growth in a healthy way by staying true to themselves as much as possible in order to grow in ways conducive to their greater goals. With none of this, however, Alan Gabriel has no real point of his own, and with nothing left, has only embraced his nihilistic arrogance. This in turn directly leads to his downfall, as he, with no greater perspective or cares or goals or anything really, commits fully to the great folly for which he is ultimately consumed. As with no truth, Alan Gabriel has no humanity, and Alan Gabriel cannot even be true to himself. Before we get on to more characters, though, I think it's important to see how the characters of Schwartzwald and Alan lead us into a discussion about the Big O's talk on God and religious themes throughout the series. Like many anime, the Big O references religion and seems to have its own take on it, although it is one that is rather zoomed out and rather accommodating / vague. To examine this, let's first look at how the series explores what is possibly a higher power, and eventually how if we could even recognize a higher power if it was actually in our presence in, say, the form of a human. In addition, let's also look at other aspects of religion touched on by the series. Now, just as a disclaimer, this is not to promote or bash religion. Everyone can believe whatever they choose to. It's just a look at how the Big O interprets and speaks on religious, mythical, higher, spiritual, esoteric, whatever you want to call it, ideas and powers and concepts. Also, this part of the retrospective may not be the most coherent, as a lot of it is based mostly on what I can only describe as some kind of intuition. I mean, there's definite concrete stuff to what I'm saying here, but the esoteric way in which the Big O handles anything vaguely religious makes it kind of an odd topic or aspect of the series to approach, although I really like that because it does play into the kind of mysterious atmosphere present throughout the series. First, however, let's take a look at religion's place in the show, i.e. the surface stuff. While religious themes are not an overt theme or presence throughout the show, there are many examples of religious symbolism throughout the series, and religion is referenced and shown to be important to many of the citizens in Paradigm. Religious symbolism, in fact, appears from episode 1, in fact from the very beginning of the series, with the iconic "Cast in the Name of God, Ye Not Guilty," which, although admittedly chosen by producers only because it quote sounded cool, does open our eyes to the idea that the idea of higher powers will, at least to some extent, be a little important in the thematic garden of the Big O. And these subtle religious elements grow over time to eventually become their own kind of little component of the series, and even have a few episodes semi-dedicated to semi-religious themes. Now I say semi-dedicated to semi-religious because a lot of the times when the Big O approaches religion, it tries to do so as unovertly as possible. It never straight up says, hey, you want to learn about this specific religion? Instead, we see religious characters vaguely hint at how their doctrines or beliefs may help them or shape their beliefs. But specific doctrines and beliefs are not necessarily stated. We can see that there are spiritual elements here, but the point is that those elements are present. The point is not what those actual elements are or what their doctrines would be. This is in line with the idea of that are multiple interpretations that can be correct to multiple people for many, many things present throughout the Big O. Over time, though, the discussion of a higher power is taken more and more seriously, and eventually kind of sort of rises to the forefront of the themes of the show. And by the conclusion of the show, the Big O seems to somewhat directly state that the, quote, idea of higher powers is, quote, true enough. And I specify true enough because A, the series is open to interpretation and wants you to come to your own interpretations, but B, what constitutes a god or truth or whatever is always given a very flexible and malleable definition by the Big O. There's never any concrete answers to these things by design, and not even a sort of definition is given. This is the show saying that yes, there's definitely things out there, there's definitely things that we don't know of or can comprehend, but what those things are up for you to decide, for you to interpret, for you to discover, because there is no real singular correct interpretation. And I think this is highlighted by the fact that while many real-world religious ideas are hinted at, only one is blatantly mentioned, and that of course is the Christian imagery present throughout the series. There are some crosses present, and in the Heaven's Day episode, Alex Rosewater says that, quote, Heaven's Day used to mark the birth of God's Son. This, of course, is a reference to Jesus Christ. Now, I don't know if the Christian imagery is present because the show wants to promote a Christian view of the world. I honestly don't think it is. I think it's more because Kaneka, one of the guys that worked on the show, finds Christianity, or at least used to find Christianity, as fascinating from a very scholarly point of view. This does not mean that this is a throwaway line, though. I think its presence lends itself well enough to how the idea of higher powers and gods are kind of presented and interpreted in the Big O. They're always kind of hinted at, but they're never blatantly mentioned, other than perhaps the bigs being called the powers of God made by men. However, since they are said to be made by men, it's an acknowledgement that they're not really gods, they're just super powerful. So I'm going to give that a disqualification. You see, when I first was typing the script, I struggled to pin down exactly what the series was saying on God. I felt like it was saying a lot, but it wasn't really that clear. And then I realized that's probably by design. You see, the Big O presents all of these higher concepts of whatever could be out there as a very nebulous possibility, and says that there is many right answers when it comes to whatever questions you might be seeking to answer these things. However, there is no single correct answer that is applicable to everyone. You gotta come to your own interpretations with your own views. This in line both confronts the idea that there is a singular correct interpretation of a higher power, and yet supports the concept of higher powers or a higher power being something somewhere. It says that there is a thing or power or powers above humanity beyond their comprehension. It is an affirmation of something. There are many valid interpretations to God, after all, and the point of the Big O is not to say which one is correct, but to encourage people to come to their own interpretation that is correct to them. And the show even confirms this when Roger states that, quote, he, Schwartzwald, was always in search of his own truth. Did he not realize that there is probably more than one truth? This higher power, in turn, yields a massive influence and presence throughout the series and to many characters in the series, and yet this is not always the most apparent. The Big O states, okay, there's a god or something, but what is it? You figure it out. This isn't lazy or dispassionate writing, but it instead serves to support the concept, but push the viewer to form their own interpretation of said concept. The point of the imagery is not to confirm a certain notion of God, but to merely postulate its possible existence. Within universe, there are many interpretations of higher powers given or hinted at in many different scenes. There are many who seem to hold the view of a traditional, omnipresent, monotheistic God, as seen in the various church scenes and in the Advent episode. And then there's also those that have a very esoteric, mystical view of spiritual presences, as shown by Schwartzwald's quest to find the ephemeral truth and the plot of the world, if you will, the will of fate, one might say. And then there's also scientific views brought up by other characters in the series, people who kind of acknowledge the bigs as being man-made powers, with power to the extent that their powers are called agents of God, however also recognizing the bigs as creations of man, and therefore a mechanical triumph of man, a scientific triumph. To some extent, these interpretations all are valid. Depending on who is asked at what point in their life, perhaps all three of these interpretations may be correct or false to different extents. That's not to say that anyone is wrong, but merely that this is such a wide and vast concept that no one is going to be 100% right or wrong, and that there's simply a vast multitude of interpretations, and one of the points of the show is to get everyone to come to their own interpretation. Everyone is going to interpret different things different ways, but it seems to be that there is some agreement in the Big O that there is something beyond humanity, or at the very least that humanity is not omnipresent and should not try to fly too close to the sun. Whatever is above humanity could be God or the laws of physics or all of the above. That doesn't really matter in this context of the show, as what matters is the influence that these forces have on those who view them as such. Depending on how one views higher powers, they may comfort them or may creep them out. They may see God as a savior or as a cosmic horror. And this is a commentary on the power of myth and religion, regardless of interpretation. What makes these kind of views true to people is not objective proof, or whether or not those around them believe them, but their own inner convictions. And thus, this conviction is how mythical and religious spiritual forces can shape people and hold power over them. The point is that humanity is not the ultimate power, and whatever is, how one interprets that thing is going to shape them greatly. Whether it's a traditional Christian view of God, or a more Buddhist interpretation of reincarnation, or perhaps some scientific law, or a mixture of all of these things and many more things. What really matters is to what extent someone truly believes in these things and how that belief shapes them and their subjective truths. I don't think that this is a dig on religion, though. I think that this is simply a statement on the function of religion in the human experience. Historically, religion has been a key pillar in society, and its influences have far resonated even to this day, for better and worse. Now, it cannot be denied that, especially in many historical cases, organized religion was a focal point for many questionable ideas. There have been countless religious wars throughout history, and there have been countless examples of religious intolerance stemming from religious institutions, as well as countless other abuses of power. This cannot be denied. However, said organizations also provided many historical services to many communities. Take for a fact that monasteries were often vast repositories of historical knowledge, or the fact that churches served as unifying forces for those who followed them. There is both good and bad to organized religion. In addition, how one interprets religion in their personal life also needs to be taken into account. Many might see the idea of religion as something that could subjugate people, as an opiate of the masses to be rejected. However, in many cases, humans also turn to religion on their own in order to help them get through the troubles in life by seeking comfort in higher powers, or the idea that there is good out there, and many people do find genuine solace in it, and this does genuinely help them live better lives. And there's nothing wrong with that. All of these things are two sides of the same coin. The characters here also go on their own kind of religious journeys, if you will, and by the end, most seem to show some kind of reverence for a higher power of sorts. Whether it's Schwartzwald teaming up with Big Duo from Beyond the Grave, to Roger blatantly stating that he's no atheist in episode 3, everyone, with the exception of Al and Gabriel, does seem to acknowledge that humans are not the be-all, end-all. They all have their own views, though, and these in turn shape their perception of the world. This is a commentary on the impact of the individual's beliefs on their own psyche and how they live their own lives. Even if God cannot be known, the idea of God imparts and impacts views upon the mind, which in turn subtly shape its actions and beliefs. For example, Schwartzwald fears the unknown. He fears what he doesn't know, and he fears that humans are dying, and thus he feels fear for a higher power that he feels certainly must exist. He fears it because A, he does not know it, and B, because anything of that magnitude would of course have the power to destroy humanity at any moment should it choose to. Now that higher power obviously doesn't choose to, as Angel does reset the universe. However, Schwartzwald realizes that theoretically it could happen, and as someone who's constantly scared of what he doesn't know, but seeks fear, it's easy to see how this kind of creates a feedback loop for the guy. Meanwhile, Roger is someone who believes in the dignity of man. He likes talking and negotiation, and believes in these convictions, in reasoning and bargaining. As such, he believes that whoever or whatever could have created people will probably also have such dignified principles, having bestowed them to its creations. Thus, by the end of the series, he is bold enough to talk to the god of the show, that is Angel, and approach her as a man who, while knowing his place, is not afraid to state his own views and speak up for them. And this, of course, gets us to Angel herself. In the context of the Big O universe, the fictional setting, Angel can be seen as the god of the world, yet how she operates and what she does is not fully expanded upon. With her first appearance, she seems to be a relatively normal person, perhaps some kind of femme fatale in line with conventional noir tropes. Later appearances, however, slowly start to show her to be something more than that. She slowly becomes more human and relatable as the series progresses, struggling with questions of her past, her scars, and her relationships with others. And as we progress, more and more religious symbolism and power is foisted upon her. I mean, her name is literally Angel. Not only is the main cast unaware that God is in their presence, but so is the god herself. Distracting the viewers from the idea that Angel might be some kind of higher power is also the presence of the Bigs, which are blatantly called agents of God, and thus distract from Angel even more. This makes the ending even more bizarre, which I really like, to be honest, by exploring the idea of what if God decided to take a human form among us. And while that may seem like a Christian idea, it's present in a lot of religions, actually. And the idea that God could be anywhere and come at any time, at any minute, and take any form is also present in a myriad of religions. Now, I do not think that is to say that Angel is the be-all, end-all of everything according to the Big O. It's simply to say that relative to her creation, she is its creator and therefore it's God in a sort of way. She's not the correct answer of what is God, but just a kind of proof of concept that there is validity to the idea of God existing in some form. Angel is not a true God, but a relative God when comparing her power to that of her creations. Now, when I say relative God, I don't mean like an actual deity, but something with so much power over another figure that from the perspective of the weaker power, the other does wield an inordinate, one might say godlike, power over them. Real-world examples of this could be like you towering over an ant. You're no god, but to an ant, you are pretty powerful. And this is shown in the show when Angel is described as the, quote, director, and the other characters are shown to be models for her, quote, project. However, the fact that she really is just a director, and the fact that she is also going through a lot of stuff out of her control, kind of basically proves that she's just a relative god and not the true god in the series. And oddly enough, this even kind of mirrors the real-world production of the Big O, as a second season for 26 episodes was initially considered before getting cut to 13. In this real-world case, the quote gods of the show decided to shorten it. Perhaps Angel is a stand-in for that. Anyways, while the show does not explain everything Angel or God related, I think that this too is intentional and gets back to the idea that we gotta make up our own interpretations. They don't bother trying to fully describe or expand upon God because for a variety of reasons, God cannot be fully explained. No matter one's belief, I'm sure that they acknowledge that whatever they view to be the highest thing cannot be comprehended in its entirety. No one knows the entirety of God from a religious sense, and for sure we don't know the entirety of scientific law out there. The point is that it's up to an individual to decide what esoteric presences are above humanity, and how their view of these presences will shape their lives and behaviors. What's more, it's also important to acknowledge there is no singular answer to these things, and that we gotta respect the answers that others may come up for themselves. And really, I think that's what the show wants us to take away from all of this. It wants us to come up with our own ideas, and then cling to them and let them guide us to live the best harmonious lives that we can. But what if someone tries to play God? So far, we have seen a man who obsesses over the truth, and a man who says that there is none. But what of a man who tries to create the sole truth? That man would be Alex Rosewater, the leader of Paradigm Corporation, and by extension Paradigm City. Now Big Al's place in the story is one which evolves over time. He's first introduced in passing in episode 4, I think it's literally like 6 or 7 frames if I remember, and from there he slowly starts to feature in more and more episodes, and makes it known how dominant he is. Over time he becomes an antagonistic force in the series, and this really starts to pick up steam around episode 13, in which he concludes a deal with the Union that involves him selling out Paradigm City for Big Foul. Eventually around episode 20, Alan becomes a main antagonist, crosses the Union, and asserts dominance as he beats them up with Big Foul. Big Foul initially refuses him though, deeming him not worthy, although Alex does figure a workaround using Dorothy's memory core. He then seeks to create a new world order by using Big Foul, but is ultimately foiled by Roger, Dorothy, and the Big O, using the Big O's patented Mega Dong Cannon. Finally, Big Al meets his end when Big Venus comes up to him and says, "It's time to tap out, buddy." She doesn't actually say this, but I thought it would be cool. Anyways, back to the script. Now when I type my scripts, it's usually a pretty free-flowing process. You get a stream of conscious going, and that gets typed out, and then organized and refined. A lot of the time, a lot is said, and then cut down and refined into a more coherent and cohesive statement. Alex was the exception to this, however, as I feel like I had a vague idea of what I wanted to say, but never quite got there. And then it hit me. That's probably for a reason, and I think I've identified that reason, and by extension, the main theme of Alex Rosewater, his main character. The reason is that Alex Rosewater's character in and of itself feels somewhat incomplete. I do not mean to say that he's lacking a goal or point or humanity like Alan Gabriel, or that the writers never got around to writing his character arc. No, nothing like this. But instead, Alex Rosewater intentionally seems like someone that is not quite a fully mature man. A complete person, if you will. Now, judging by his physical appearance, Alex Rosewater is at least 30, so I don't mean that he's literally incomplete. I mean that in a more metaphorical sense. He doesn't come off as someone who's had the necessary life experiences to mature him into a good or even functional man. This guy, in fact, if he wasn't the head of Paradigm Corporation, would probably be seen as a bit of a weirdo, or, like, that guy. And this is because Alex Rosewater hasn't really accomplished anything on his own, or any real growth to a large extent, and Big Foul even states this when it deems Alex Rosewater not. That is, not worthy, or complete. All of this means that he comes off as immature and out of touch. He obviously lacked great hardship growing up and seems to have lacked a disciplinarian too, as he has no real sense of others. He lacks empathy and expects others to adore him simply for being him. At first he comes off as a regretless narcissist, and for this reason comes off as a bit of a phony. And later he seems to transition into either a man of grandiose delusions or a man-child compensating for something. I would assume a low self-esteem. Either way, he seeks to serve himself only, and we struggle to relate to this guy because he lacks empathy for others, and it's obvious that he's only serving his own delusions of grandeur. Now, I do like to joke about how dominant this guy is, but it is true to some extent that he is a fan of physical shows of power, a physical display of how he's allegedly on top and expects to remain there, that he is dominant. And this is because of some insecurity, because as far as he can tell, his only real purpose is to wield material power, and this alienates him because he doesn't have or struggles to establish the bonds that really help people grow into better versions of themselves. He is human, and he does have human moments, but he's generally unrelatable and distant, and all of this ties back into his apparent disregard for others, based inside of an immature and insecure narcissism. But how can a man so dominant, a man that gets things done, be insecure about anything? Some might be asking, what evidence do you have for this? How dare you slander Mr. Rosewater? Well, I think that there is enough evidence throughout the show, and it's pretty apparent in some cases. When Rosewater is first introduced, he's portrayed as cold and calculating, a busy man of business who is all about business, and you can tell all of this from the first 6 frames we see him in. Joking aside, as we get to know Rosewater though, this dominant exterior is peeled back, and we start to see other softer parts of him. In fact, he feels like a different character past a certain point, and part of me questions if this is due to intentional writing changes, inconsistent writing, or if this is just something that was cooked up as they were going along because they were running out of production time fast. I would assume it's a mixture of all three, although it does feel somewhat intentional. Either way, in Season 2, we see a lot more of Big Al, and we can soon tell that he is insecure based on how he projects himself. He always comes off as someone who wants to seem powerful. Even though he is, it never seems to be enough for him though. He comes off as part psychopathic businessman, part spurned child, and these both show the same insecurity. He openly proclaims that he is a born dominus, a born leader, a born man of talent and action, a leader of men, a dominant man. And yet, why would he be so insecure if he knows all these things and is allegedly confident of them? If he really is the dominus that he proclaims to be, why would he need to talk himself up so much? Especially to himself, especially if he's already in control of everything, and everyone seems to acknowledge this. It's because he fears himself. He fears that he isn't good or strong enough to be who he says he is. He is someone who proclaims that he is the be-all and end-all to everybody because he's afraid that he isn't to anybody. And this leads to an examination of his regression into his childlike states. In fact, the most interesting part of Alex's character is how he starts to swing between the two moods of dominant bruiser and crazy kid. And while these two may seem like very different states, they do make sense as manifestations of his insecurities. Childlike behaviors include how he fawns over Big Fow, his new toy, and how he literally makes a smaller toy of Big Fow, or how he panics when it stops working, or just how impulsively he makes a deal with the union so he can have Big Fow in the first place. None of these decisions are purely logical, and it's clear that there is some deep emotional component present, even if he doesn't understand it himself. He does all of these things for himself so that he can feel some kind of love or attention. Anything to fill the deep hole inside of him. The metaphorical hole, of course. Now, he does all these things in order to make his own truth, his ultimate goal, and define it for others, because he is afraid that the current truth might not favor him. And the current truth haunting Alex Rosewater is the idea that his heritage isn't what he thinks, hopes, or claims it to be. You see, he's afraid that Gordon Rosewater is not his true father, even if they do seem to love each other as father and son. Alex is afraid that instead of being Gordon's true biological heir, he's merely one of the youth that was implanted with memories referred to throughout the series as tomatoes. This would be disastrous for Alex's psyche because it would mean that he, in his own view, is not Gordon's true son and therefore not entitled to all he currently has. He would not be as good or as special as he thinks he is. In fact, he would be nothing at all, since all he has and all that he knows is power, and all of this stems from his inheritance, which of course would be moot if he's not actually Gordon's true son. And this idea that someone is nothing is crushing for anyone, not just domineering and busy businessmen. In fact, I would say that the fear of someone being meaningless is actually a very normal and justified fear. It's why everyone seeks to give their life meaning through interpersonal interactions, relations, professions, hobbies, etc., etc. People want to have meaning and establish their own meaning and truths and modify those around them, adapting to those they can't change and growing as a person along the way. No one wants to be meaningless. And Alex Rosewater is afraid that he is. However, as an immature man who has only known power, power is the only solution he can think of turning to. This is because he has been raised in a position of power for years. Blunt power is the only thing he knows, so he concludes that he must use this thing in order to prove his fears wrong. He must prove his meaning by asserting his dominance over the truth itself, and this manifests in his ego quest of creating a new world centered around him. It's not so much to lord over others, but over his own nagging insecurities relating to his birthright. He must prove himself to himself, but unfortunately lacks the self-awareness and self-esteem to do so in a healthy manner. Instead, he embarks on an ego quest to bend the truth to his will, instead of learning the truths of the world and adapting to them. In the end, he pays for this when Angel, as Big Venus, effortlessly taps him out of existence. And the irony is clear here, as that the most dominant man in Paradigm was simply tapped out for trying to dominate everything around him. The moral here is also clear, as it shows that seeking only worldly power and power over others is unhealthy and will ultimately earn a just punishment. Where the Big O does tell the audience that they must pick, choose, make, and modify their own truths, Alex Rosewater is a very clear warning against simply relying on power in an attempt to brute force all of one's personal truths upon the world and others. Yes, it is important to share and have dialogue with others, but you cannot tell someone to believe a certain thing at all times. You can make suggestions or have dialogues, but you cannot enforce your opinions or wills on others. It's just not right, and Alex Rosewater shows this. Now, that's not to make him out as Alan Gabriel 2.0. I just want to take a second here to distinguish between the two. You see, Alan has no goals and is selfish out of psychopathic disregard for basically anything. He lacks humanity as a whole. Alex, on the other hand, struggles with goals and the truth, therefore acknowledging that they do exist, and is selfish out of a desire to compensate for his own insecurities and emotions. These are human traits. As noted earlier, Alex is still very human, it's just that he shows traits of humanity which are not so desirable. I would also like to say that I may seem to be throwing Big Al a bone here. I am not. He is still a very unlikable man, and I don't think I'd like to hang out with him, and I do think he got what he deserved. Although I also think that it's fittingly ironic that the most dominant man in Paradigm couldn't even dominate his own insecurities. And Alex Rosewater's fear of his questionable heritage gets us into another big theme of the Big O, which is a fear of the past, whether that be fear of a past that you do not know, or something that you do not know from the past coming back to haunt you. There are many ways that the past can haunt someone, and many are explored throughout the Big O. 3 will be talked on here. We are going to look at how Alex Rosewater's fear of an uncertain heritage hampers his judgment and leads him to making improper decisions, as already glossed over in the previous segment. Secondary, we're going to look at how the fear of something coming out of the past can bog one's motions down and clog one's mind, as manifested by Dan Datsun literally shooting a ghost of the past. Finally, we're going to get onto a discussion about how a lack of a past can elicit one's fear that they do not know themselves, and therefore are either unjustified in what they're doing, or have no idea where to go to from here. In addition, we're also going to briefly examine how each of these characters deal with their respective fears manifesting, and what we can glean from their approaches as well. Starting with Rosewater, Rosewater fears an uncertain historical narrative. He sets the bar for being the most afraid of the past in a nebulous sense. He's afraid of history, if you will, because if it doesn't quite break his way, well, then he really isn't that special at the end of the day, and he's just some guy, which would be devastating for a man who's built his entire ego, or whatever you could call that, upon his birthright. Now, looking at how Alex deals with these fears, we see a very insecure man blindly lashing out at things which he doesn't understand. Humans naturally fear the unknown, so knowing that you don't know whether or not your historical narrative is correct is quite frightening. This makes Alex reason, the past is bad. Me destroy past. In a sense, Alex is a representation of how fear can blind someone and lead them to just flailing about, essentially. Alex does not really seem to be a man with a really thought out plan, but more of a loose scattershot sprangling of ideas, which eventually coagulate into him proclaiming that he will make the new world order in his own image. As we can see, fear has clouded his judgment, and as a result, he ends up destroying the very city which he lorded over relatively successfully for the previous X amount of years. And this also kind of ties into Schwartzwald's view of the past. Now, I didn't mention Schwartzwald in the beginning of this segment. However, I think it should be noted that both he and Alex, they live in constant fear of not knowing what has happened in the days that preceded the shared memory of Paradigm City. He sees a past that is unknown as something to be terrified of. However, he sees this as a good thing for the sake of evolution. In spite of this, though, it is curious that Alex and Schwartzwald, the people that fear the unknown the most throughout the series, end up both being blinded by this very fear. Alex goes on his ego quest, and Schwartzwald basically throws his whole life away to pursue some kind of weird, esoteric trip that doesn't necessarily have the most positive impact on his life. They're both blinded by fear, and their illogical approaches to confronting this fear lead them into making not good life decisions. This leads us to the topic of Dan Datsun confronting his fear of the past. Datsun's fear is a manifestation of the fear that something out of our past will come back and get us. In his case, it is this young lady and her balloon who end up being Union agents terrorizing Paradigm for the tenure of this episode. I think it's Wintergreen Phantom. It's the one with the big toy robot. This is another good example of the past, or of the unknown in general, being able to scare someone. Datsun knows that realistically he's not going to learn the previous events of Paradigm City. He's lived in this amnesia brain fog for a while now, and he's okay with it. He's accepted it. However, this specific case gets to him because it's something which seems vaguely familiar to him. And often the things that are the most vaguely familiar can be the most fear-eliciting, because they're close enough to get under our skin, as the vague memory of this young woman definitely gets under his skin. It messes with his senses of reality and his temporal judgment. However, as a cop, as a man in control of himself, Datsun proceeds along things very differently than both Schwartzwald and Alex. Now, he's obviously bothered by the implications of things that he doesn't know, but he doesn't let this completely cloud his judgment. He is not lost in primal fear, and he doesn't simply try to brute force his way into some kind of security. Instead, Datsun takes a level-headed and logical approach to the issue. He slowly and surely works his way through what he can, assembling what pieces are available to him to try and construct some kind of sufficient narrative. And when this fails, when he realizes that he can't construct a narrative because things just don't make sense and he probably will never be able to at this point, he just accepts this and kind of moves on with his life. He knows that the past is a concept and it's not really something that one can really fight or even really shape past manipulating historical narratives. It is a very nebulous concept after all. All Datsun can do, and all that he reasons he can do, is learn what he can and then just proceed to calmly make a series of logical decisions in order to try and get the best possible outcome available for today. He logics his way through his fears and bolsters himself with his convictions that even if he doesn't know his past, he is who he is today, and he knows who that person is. While he is initially haunted of the things that he doesn't know, he confronts them as calmly as he can, and once he accepts the reality that he's never really going to know these things, he gets over this by saying that that won't stop him from progressing as a person. It's not going to end his present. And this helps him bolster himself so that he can take the final step of figuratively and literally killing the specter of the past haunting him. He decides to live in today instead of living in constant fear and the personal regression that can bring. Staying on Datsun for a second, I want to touch on two things about this scene. A, I think that it's really cool that Datsun literally shoots a specter of the past. Not only because of how weird and crazy and dumb that sounds, but also because it's a very striking manifestation of the Big O telling us, hey, you gotta move on. You gotta stop dwelling on all the bad experiences of the past because, well, you don't want to be like this guy sitting in this movie theater feeling trapped all the time. Instead, you gotta work your way through things, and this episode is about Datsun doing that. Now, I'm not condoning violence. Datsun shooting this woman is not a statement in favor of violence or of solving past grievance violently, but instead just a very literal metaphor about discarding one's past. Datsun is saying, hey, I know I don't really understand these things or don't remember them too clearly, but I'm going to get over that and move on with my life. It's not a recommendation for violence. It's just a extremely anime way of saying that Datsun has decided that the past will not determine who he is or have an undue influence over his life. On the secondary note, the entire construction of this episode is great and probably one of the biggest hints that something is off before we really know the true nature of Angel. It seems like the episode purposefully mocks the idea of there being a single timeline here, or purposely mocks the idea that there is really that much lore present. When we really zoom out and look at things from a very literal sense, that is, if we try to construct an actual timeline of Datsun's memories and actions in this episode, it's very obvious that there's no way that we can reconcile him being in all these places with this woman at all these different times and being the same age that he is currently. Like, there's no way we could reconcile any of these things, and the episode makes it readily apparent by making a timeline that is purposely skewed. It's very weird, and I think this is a very obvious hint to the viewer that, hey, the timeline is not really A, that important, and B, it is definitely wonky later on. I really like this because it does hint at that and opens our eyes to the fact that there's some temporal issues in this universe and not just some big amnesia fog. However, we'll talk about that more at some point in the retrospective, I'm sure. We need to get back to our topic of fear here, which leads us to the greatest fear of the Big O, which is the fear of not knowing oneself. Now, this is not necessarily exclusively a fear of the past or something of the past coming out to get you, but not knowing one's past can greatly extenuate the fear that you do not know yourself, since you might not be familiar with the entirety of your life experiences or the context of your life that have gotten you to where you are today and made you the person you are today. Just think how terrifying it would be if you woke up and you still believed everything that you believe currently, but you didn't know why. This is how the collective amnesia of Paradigm fosters in a sense of constant self-doubt and questioning that can overwhelm certain characters. And oddly enough, the one that states this the most and manifests this most is Roger. Because although he is super cool and has his own code and ethics and everything, he makes a specific point of not questioning the past, and as a result, by the time he realizes that maybe he should a little, he feels completely overwhelmed by a, to him, seeming lack of context in which to frame his life. He knows who he is and he knows what he believes, but he is overwhelmed by this notion that he doesn't know why he believes these things that he believes or knows these things that he knows. This shows how a fear of not knowing the past can start to creep in around the corners of our mind and make us fear ourselves, that we don't know ourselves. However, Roger does overcome this by, similar to Datsun, logicking his way through things and asserting that even if he doesn't know why he is the person he is now, he is still that person and is relatively familiar with it, that he can still wear his own clothes comfortably and be his own man at the end of the day. However, that's not necessarily that easy to do, and this fear of not knowing oneself and the constant doubt it can bring can still be overwhelming. And to examine that, let's look at a fifth example, why not? The example of Angel. Now, Angel's character is one which grows slowly over the course of the series. However, it's obvious that she's undergone some trauma and that the Big O universe is kind of her escape from the real world. For the longest time, she didn't know who she was, both in and out of universe, as she dealt with various personal issues, and her character development reflects this. Her character is kind of a representation of the grief cycle, which we'll talk about when we get to her portion of the retrospective, and it's constantly haunted, at least early on, by not really knowing who she is as a person, and this bothers her constantly and explains why she seeks out the memories, why she seeks out the context of who she is. Not knowing why you are the person you are, and not knowing who the person you are kind of feed into each other, and Angel displays this brilliantly. She's bothered not only by not knowing who she is, but because she doesn't have any context to try and figure out who she is. She can't take and use any kind of context to bolster her views. And this haunts her even up until almost the ending of the series, where she finally does reveal her true form and come to some kind of terms in the real world. Before she is able to do this, though, she kind of just goes through the motions and is terrified of not knowing who she is. Although I would like to say that this fear did push her to action from time to time, which may lend a shred of credence to Schwartzwald's delusional methodology. You see, Schwartzwald's views also express a blatant fear of not knowing oneself. However, he's terrified not of the idea that people don't know their starting point, but that they will never accomplish their final point. That is to say, that they will never really realize who they are meant to be or could be. Schwartzwald is terrified that instead people will just sink in the decadence and never grow enough to accomplish greatness, or their final form, if you will. He's terrified of people just going through the motions and waiting to die. He is terrified of the possible consequences of not being the best person that you can be, because if one doesn't know what they're capable of, how can anyone grow to know the world? How can anyone grow at all? How can one grow to know the truth? At the end of the day, you need to have at least a semblance of who you are and gain more information about that person and formulate their identity as you progress with your life in general, as you learn as a person. And you need a foundation because you are the only one that will be with yourself at all times. So Schwartzwald's fear is logical, because why would you want to be with someone who never grows, who never accomplishes what they could? For if one doesn't have oneself, then they truly have no one, and they truly don't know anything. And as mentioned previously, the greatest fear is the unknown. However, even in this world of unknowns, of massive robots, of giant conspiracies, and artificial realities and constructions, it's important to note that the Big O also has many grounded elements which endear it to us, and many grounded characters which prove that even in the seeming direst of circumstances, the average Joe can still live and even thrive. And the manifestation of this is the man himself, Dan Datsun. Now, while Datsun doesn't necessarily do that much in a plot sense, although he does have many important small moments, I consider him, and Norman Berg, critical characters to the Big O because they ground it in a way that some of the other over-the-top characters simply can't. Roger Smith is the overpowered Batman of anime. Dorothy Wainwright is an android with incredible strength. Angel is the deus ex machina of this series. So Dan and Norman fill important spots, being none of those things, as they help us as regular people fall back into the Big O and realize that in spite of the big ideas present, there's also a big presence played by average people, and that average people are still valid and still contribute even in this world of seeming mechanical monstrosities and where reality itself is warped. Dan Datsun doesn't swing the hardest, but by golly does he swing a lot. And he's always there for the viewer to become familiar with, relate to, and root for. For this reason, I also put Norman Berg here, as I do feel his consistent presence and helpful nature have earned him some attention too, but admittedly there's not enough of him to really warrant an entire portion to himself, and both characters kind of convey the same point to the viewer. Shout out to Big Ear too, my guy. Anyways, the point of this portion is that even in a land of amnesia, even in a land of giant robots, even in a land of mystery, and even in a land where the writers have to come up with an off-the-wall ending because they're running out of money, the average Joe is still out and about, getting by and contributing to society. As for the introduction and plot significance of these characters, Dan Datsun is a police leader in Paradigm City, and shows up many times to either tell Roger something helpful, respond to a giant robot fight, or do something else. He is a hard-nosed cop, but a very good cop, and a good man, who insists on asking questions and acting honorably. While he lacks physical power in a world of giant robots, he is still a great help to Roger, and even saves his life when he inspires his men to distract Alex Rosewater long enough to save Roger in the Big Foul Big O fight. Norman, on the other hand, is Roger's faithful butler, Big O repairman, and jack of all trades. While he is an excellent engineer and crack shot, he is usually at home simply cooking or cleaning. As Big O's engineer though, and Roger's main guy, he is a critical asset, assuring Roger has the support he needs to get the job done, and both of these two characters are essential in spite of their seemingly small role. You see, the reason these two characters are essential is because they're the most realistic characters in the whole show, and they show that life does find a way. Not all of us can be anime Batman, or the Mummy of Truth, or a cyborg hitman, or dominant, but we can all be paper pushers, we can all do our jobs, and we can all contribute. And this shows that even in a world where someone may think they have no agency, take Dan Datsun and the police's constant and futile attempts to respond to the bigs alone or by themselves, people still get by. Sure, life may seem daunting and overbearing at times, but living one day at a time, we can all get by and be proud what we have accomplished and learned along the way. The average Joe is still valid, and he's still around, and while he may not be able to directly stand up to a big robot, he can still have his impact on the world around it, or at least help others avoid the giant robot fight. While living in Paradigm without a big to help you fight any one of the slew of monsters of the week may seem horrifying, the average Joe is not reduced to nothing, and is not made pointless, and not reduced to a puddle of fear. He is not simply trembling in his boots waiting the end of all. No, instead he still goes by his daily functions and gets stuff done. He is able to maintain an average life, which, in the context of the Big O universe full of giant fights and amnesia, is an accomplishment in and of itself. Now again, we don't see anime Batman in real life, but we do see guys taking out the literal trash. We do see people getting work done. And in all honesty, if I were to live in the Big O universe, I would probably even have an even more mundane life. That's not a knock on these characters or myself, it's just to say that I think their mundane nature is good writing. And it's even a kind of strength. The strength of finding purpose in the mundane. While the word mundane might have negative connotations, it shouldn't necessarily at all times. While everyone is different and unique in their own ways, we all have our own goals and views and dreams, we also carry out a lot of mundane tasks and responsibilities in our everyday lives. That's simply how things are. There are just things that need to be done, and not all of them are the most glamorous or exotic. And this lack of glamour is what makes these two characters so cool. Dan Datsun and Norman Berg show us that just because people are the things that they are, and that we don't always have the greatest or flashiest lives or events going on in our lives still have meaning and points. Both of these characters are still very invested in what they do, and the impact of what they do has a surprisingly large impact on the world of Paradigm City, even if less of a physical impact than, say, Roger and the Big O. They still contribute to the city and show that anyone, regardless of a giant robot or not, can still contribute. And this is recognized too, as they and their duties are essential to the plot going on. This shows that to some extent, anyone can shape their own fate with or without a giant robot. This shows to some extent, anyone can shape their own fate simply through simple actions. You see, the Big O would be kind of hypocritical if the whole point of the show being seize your destiny was made, but then we only saw overpowered and unrealistic anime characters. This would create an atmosphere where the viewer could rightfully dismiss this point on the basis that they themselves are not an overpowered anime character. They don't have a giant mech, nope, they just work at the local store or something else. But by having Dan and Norman in the show, Dan and Norman in the show, performing their everyday tasks as best as they can, as mundane as they may be, we can see that even average Joes have agency and affect the world around them. And this is further rewarded when it turns out that even if not the flashiest, these two still do critical work and are critical to the success of Roger. This shows that there's nothing wrong with being square. In fact, some would even say it's hip. There's no reason to be embarrassed that you are not the one in the giant robot, because in reality, most of us will not be. However, the person that is in that robot is still going to need support, is still going to need help. And if you can help that person, you are still contributing and you still have meaning. So even if you don't think that you are the one in charge or have the biggest impact, you're still needed. Roger still very much needs Norman and Dan and both are still valid and dignified men. You see, while we would like to engross ourselves in the role of Roger Smith, negotiator extraordinaire, and we all think it would be super cool to pilot the Big O, because it would, larger-than-life characters need average people like Dan and Norman to function, let alone stand out. In this way, they also make the show much more accessible to us, because they are normal people living relatively normal, or at least as far as the Big O is concerned, normal lives. And it helps us fit into this universe by seeing people like or closer to us functioning in this universe and contributing to it as well. My point here is that Dan and Norman and their mundane nature helps the viewer relate to and ingratiate themselves in the world of Paradigm City, and they also emphasize the unique role of Roger Smith. By showing off two characters so mundane, it makes the hero of Roger Smith stick out even more. And it also shows that even if we ourselves may not think ourselves to be heroes, we can all still make meaningful contributions and live meaningful lives. Dan and Norman still have degrees of agency over themselves and the lives they live, even if they might not always think so. They might not have the most physical power, but they still have power over themselves. And the fact that these two are still very important to Roger and the plot shows that everyone has a role to play, and that what matters most is that you choose your role and then play it as best you can. As for the starring role of the Big O, that of course falls upon one Roger Smith, negotiator extraordinaire, and of course the main character in this series. Now, approaching Roger Smith was a daunting task, seeing as that he is the character that we spend the most time with, and one of a surprising amount of complexity, once we realize that he's not simply a jack-of-all-trades, super overpowered anime Batman stand-in. No, like actual Batman, he has layers of emotional complexity and even confidence issues that strike at him from time to time, although his ethical code and his ability to believe in both himself and those around him eventually help him pull through his multiple crises in order to alleviate the crisis of Paradigm City as best as possible, that is, to come to the best possible terms, something which is very fitting for a negotiator to do. Now, dissecting Roger's character, there's a few main aspects that we should really look at to understand this man and glean what we can from his development and his presence in the Big O. There is the fact that he is a negotiator and how that impacts both his views and his actions. There's his crisis of confidence that he gets from realizing that maybe the past does have some meaning and how he overcomes that. There's his relationship with Dorothy and how both it and his views change over time as he becomes more open to different perspectives and ideas. And finally, there is his evolution as a whole, which, although seemingly great, is rooted in a sense of confidence and compassion and just dignified sensibilities which carry him well throughout the series, and kind of bring his development full circle, as while he does learn a lot and have a more open mind, the foundation that we started with is still there. It's just been expanded upon. Roger Smith is the pilot of the Big O, the one entrusted to stop Rosewater, the one who talks down Big Venus/Angel, an all-around cool dude, and of course, the one who negotiates. He is an honorable and upstanding man who confidently plays by his own rules, but always does so for the greater good. Now, of course, we gotta lay out what Roger actually does in the plot in order to understand how his growth ties into it. The series starts off with Roger as a freelance negotiator, negotiating to get a captured Dorothy released. This, of course, starts the chain of events which sees her eventually join him, and the two go on some standalone adventures up until about episode 12. While these are standalone, they are important for establishing his character and his relationships. And over time, Dorothy and Roger start to grow closer, and his views start to evolve. Anyways, as the main plot starts, Roger is tasked to find who has been murdering several tomatoes. Now, tomatoes are the term that the show uses for the children that Gordon Rosewater is said to have implanted memories in, memories of before the event 40 years ago. All of this leads to Roger eventually finding a copy of Gordon's so-called prophetic book, Metropolis. This leads him to talking to Gordon. He does this because, well, he wants to get some insight on just the general happenings of the world around him, and because Metropolis is incomplete. This is odd considering that it was published and the guy who wrote it is still alive in this universe. This leads Roger to looking into it. This eventually leads to a conversation with Gordon Rosewater, who says that Metropolis is intentionally incomplete and full of lies. This is because people have their own agency, so any kind of prophetic work written by one guy is kind of folly when you think about it. At this point in the series, he feels that he had some kind of past, although he has no idea what it was, but he also feels that it was probably important to him, and he's just been glossing over this fact for years on end. All of this pressure and the idea that his past now suddenly means something combine to overwhelm Roger and force him into a mental fugue of sorts. This self-crisis is explored in episode 14 and focuses around him not knowing his past, and for this reason, him not thinking he knows who he is, although we later establish that his past doesn't really matter and he does know who he is, and he's confident in it, and that's a large part of his growth. After a tense psychological journey, he manages to reassure himself that he is him and embraces his role as the protector of Paradigm City and Roger Smith. He wins a big fight against several giant robots in the midst of this mental episode, and goes on some more standalone adventures, eventually up until the point when the Union plot kicks off around episode 20. When this does, Roger positions himself to protect Paradigm City against anyone who might seek to assail it. No matter his past, and no matter what may have happened, or that he does or does not know of, he wants to protect the city and its people. And this means defeating both Union forces and Alex Rosewater. Although he does have some issues doing this, he eventually succeeds in outlasting Rosewater as he gets tapped out by Angel, and this leads to Roger's crowning achievement, the climax of the show, and the reset of the Big O universe. And that is his negotiation with Angel herself. In this negotiation, he gives her a rousing speech convincing her of both her self-worth, her agency, and the need to go on. And this eventually convinces her to reset the Big O universe as opposed to completely destroying it. In the end, Roger helps everyone come to terms. And coming to terms is exactly what Roger Smith is all about. Not only helping clients come to terms with each other, but helping people come to terms with the world around them and their own goals, ideas, and beliefs. He even does this for himself as his character evolves throughout the series. His role as the Negotiator is one that negotiates the balanced path in life. Roger is a character which represents balance and compromise, not just between people, but between people and the world, and their views in the world. He, as the series progresses, manifests all of this as we see his own beliefs change, and he represents balancing agency with facts that one can and cannot change. He accepts that there are many actions that he can take, but also accepts that there are simply things that he simply cannot change. And his character is all about striking a compromise between these two extremes in order to live one's best life and help society in general. Roger knows and accepts that he can mold his own life and destiny according to his own views and values. However, he also knows that he's only human and cannot make or break all of the realities around him, although he can still shape the realities around him for the better. And he knows this is via his own agency. While he cannot make, break, or shape every circumstance in his life, he knows he can still influence them to some extent, and this gives him a quiet confidence to try and live his own life in his own way. And these two things are the core of his character, him doing things his own way, and him coming to terms with his own struggles. Since we're on coming to terms, we'll stick with that topic for the time being. Roger's main arc explores him coming to terms with his lack of a past. In the beginning of the series, he's set up as someone who doesn't care about memories. In fact, he willingly discards and ignores them, saying as that they would get in the way of today. However, once he learns that something important probably did happen in the past, he becomes very distraught over this, and he hyperfixates on the fact that he doesn't know his past, and this other extreme also plagues him in different ways. When he was ignoring the past, it kind of made it feel like he wasn't quite a part of the society around him, as he was willingly ignoring a large cultural phenomenon. When he was fixated with the past, he was having anxiety and crippling self-doubt because of his fixation on something he didn't have. However, he manages to come to a compromise with this struggle, noting that while he doesn't know the past, and that past may have contained critical events shaping him into the man he is today, he cannot go back to the past, and he cannot change the past. However, that doesn't mean that the past determines his future, as he is the one that determines his future. He thus comes to terms with his own lack of a past. He was overwhelmed and had a sort of crisis, but he managed to hunker down and adapt to the world around him, coming to terms satisfactory to him. On the topic of being him, let's talk about one of Roger's most endearing traits, and that is how assured he is of himself. Now, I don't mean arrogant, I mean confident. That is to say, he is a man who knows who he is, what he wants, and how he feels, but is in touch with himself and the world, and has enough self-control to pursue all of these things in a healthy way. And there is a distinction between confidence and arrogance. Roger is confident and knows that he is him. While part of his arc is him losing this confidence and then eventually regaining it, it is true that to some extent he always has a base level of confidence, and this helps him a lot. He lives by his own truths, his code, and represents a healthy respect for one's self and one's ideals. He uses his agency to exercise his personal views and apply them to himself, but doesn't force them upon others in any egregious way. In this way, he's always honest with himself, and this manifests in a healthy self-confidence, which helps him get the job done, helps him push through his own crisis regarding his past, and helps him endear himself to the audience. Roger knows that the source of true confidence should be from within oneself, and it shouldn't come from pompous boasts or overestimation of one's ability and worth, but of a silent pride that comes from sticking to one's ideals, and it should come regardless of what others hold you to be. Now, it's obvious that there are a lot of people in Paradigm City that don't necessarily respect Roger or hold him in very high regard, but he never lets this get him down. And even after his crisis of self, he holds to who he is even stronger. He does his best to embrace himself as he is the only one of him, so he better be the best him that he can be, and he does this for the greater good. He shows that this is a very healthy approach to life, as even in this weirdo setup where no one knows what happened past 40 years ago, he is still able to adapt and use his own free will to shape his life in a way satisfactory to him, even in such a bizarre world. This healthy confidence also helps Roger be a team player. He knows that while he can do a lot, he can't do everything. He needs the people around him, and he needs their help too. In fact, this common respect for others is one of his best strengths. It ensures that those close to him are always willing to help him and secure him. By fostering respect and compassion, he gains the compassion and respect of others. And this is most obvious with the Big O itself. Roger is the first to consider the Bigs as more than just simple machines. He acknowledges and respects the Big O as something above that, of something having some kind of presence that can't quite be explained. And for this reason, the Big O willingly lends him its power, and even strives to protect him in several near-miraculous events. Roger knows that he is only human, and therefore is very limited in terms of his physical abilities. As such, he relies on his team, and in return tries to protect them. He is connected to them, and they are connected to him, and these connections are rewarding for all involved, even forming a pseudo-family. All of this strengthens him greatly, even if it's not initially obvious, and by seeking to gradually evolve and push his boundaries forward, as opposed to seeking everything all at once, ignoring everything around him, or imposing his will on everything, he manages to keep a firm hold of himself and not get lost in any of these extreme directions, like say Schwartzwald, Alan, or Alex do. Roger survives and grows, and he never loses himself. He does have moments of doubt and crisis, but he always rebounds and grows firmer in his convictions. He comes to terms with things. He accepts his limitations, and while trying to pass them or gradually push himself forward, he does so in a healthy manner, and one that takes its time. This gradual evolution manifests even in his views changing over time, specifically his views on the past and his views on Dorothy. Initially, Roger tends not to question the larger context of the world around him, as he sees memories as pointless, instead preferring to keep his head down and focus on today. And this in turn limits him to an extent initially, as it makes him seem oddly disconnected from the world around him. We feel this when the series begins, as he is super cool, but he is also kind of distant. He's just kind of doing his own thing and doesn't really care about the wider world, which is so engrossed to us, and which seemingly would have a big impact on him, a citizen of that world. This is rectified as the series goes on, however, and he eventually grows to accept that there is some meaning to the past and there is some meaning to the context of our lives. He learns that memories are not something simply to be discarded. While we cannot live in our memories, they are essential to human bonds and context and history, and part of what makes us us. He starts to see this, and he starts to see the past as more than just nothing. He goes too far, however, and this leads to him having a crisis over not knowing anything of his past. He fears that if he doesn't know anything about his past, he can't know who he is. Eventually, though, he does prove that this isn't how that works, and he finds a balance between valuing the past too much and too little. He takes a pragmatic view of things. He knows that regardless of the past, he can't change it, he can't live in it, and he accepts that even if it has made him who he is today, today is today, and therefore he's got to live for it. He can still shape his own future and be who he wants to be. He comes to terms with things and comes to the conclusion that it has led him to being himself in this moment, and that person should be embraced. Another example of Roger's view changing over time are his views on Dorothy. When she first joins him, he initially seems annoyed and kind of bothered by the fact that this android just tacked herself onto the team. He even rejects the idea that she could have anything approaching humanity, and bluntly states to her face that androids are just pre-programmed machines. That is something that is subhuman and can't exert any kind of free agency or will, which Dorothy does as the series progresses. Initially, though, he just asserts that Dorothy's a machine and nothing more. As the series progresses, however, he realizes that maybe not all of Dorothy's blunt actions aren't pre-programmed responses. Maybe she does have emotions and agency and free will, and dare I say, humanity. He soon grows to see Dorothy as basically human, and eventually even grows to cherish her in some way, to accept someone he initially didn't understand or respect, overcoming his own biases to see that people are basically all the same, and until losing respect, are worthy of respect. But while Roger's views change over time, he never loses his core identity. He never loses Roger Smith. He still has the confidence that he started with, and the support of those around him have allowed him to use this confidence to evolve his views and grow as a character. He remains himself, just a more educated and open-minded version. One who has seen more things than Episode 1 Roger, and one who has triumphed through all of these circumstances. He embraces himself, and those around him give him the energy he needs to grow as a person and persevere. It gives him the confidence to negotiate with the director herself and convince her that life is worth living. You see, Roger is cool because he makes himself cool. And he does this by holding himself to his own views and styles, and people just tend to respect this kind of authenticity. He is cool because he has struck a balance between himself and the truths of the world, managing to do things his own way in spite of all the circumstances he can't change, great and small, within and without of his control. He is cool because he, on his own terms, has come to terms. One could say that Roger has even found some kind of enlightenment, or achieved the highest form that he could realistically achieve. And this gets us to another thematic discussion of the Big O, which is the Big O's approach to enlightenment. What is enlightenment? What constitutes enlightenment? And can enlightenment be forced, or must it come upon someone naturally through their own efforts? The Big O is not just about giant robots. It's also about some giant ideas. And here we'll explore one on the dissemination of ideas. That is the theme of enlightening others. How much is one to educate one another? What right does one person have to try and shape another person's thought processes and beliefs? When does concern become condescension? When does support become force? There's a difference between telling someone something that is objectively correct and something that is subjectively correct. Telling someone how to think or view the world is a very murky matter. One cannot simply force their opinions onto someone else. One may air them so that others may consider them and have a healthy dialogue about it. That's in fact a good part of personal growth, but you simply cannot say, you must think like this. It is fundamentally wrong to try and completely shape the opinions of someone else, as this strips them of their own agency to create their own self. Doing so dehumanizes someone to an extent, and this idea is found in the Big O, and it is explored with the two dynamics of Roger versus Schwartzwald and the parable of the tomatoes. To start, there is the clash of Roger and Schwartzwald. Now both have bigs, but use them for different purposes. Roger and the Big O seek to team up in order to protect the city and maintain the peace. A peace which allows the people to go about their daily lives and conduct themselves how they please. Schwartzwald and Big Duo, meanwhile, team up for a different goal. They team up to destroy Paradigm and force the people to think. They want to try and force enlightenment. Now, that is an oxymoronic task, however, as enlightenment must be sought and obtained on an individual level. Yes, one might be able to help someone enlighten themselves, but it cannot be forced. To be enlightened, one must have their own conclusions, their own goals, their own views, and they hold them firm. And any view which is forced upon someone is not their own and probably cannot be held super firmly. They will either blindly follow it, or they will lose faith in it. And this means that it cannot serve as a stable foundation for discovery or enlightenment. Therefore, any enlightenment that is forced upon someone is a false enlightenment, as they did not organically accept it. Roger, meanwhile, simply wants to allow people to basically do whatever. Schwartzwald is literally trying to force them to accept enlightenment. He is using force to impress his views upon others. And while he doesn't necessarily want them to think a certain way, he's still trying to force them to do something, which, again, is oxymoronic to enlightenment. Roger realizes that people can choose how much they want to use their brain. And Schwartzwald basically wants to port their brain into overdrive at all times, even when they may not want to. I also think that while it goes without saying that Paradigm and Alex Rosewater are both scummy, and people should question stuff, getting people to conclude that or act upon that must be done organically. Roger understands this, and while believing Rosewater is scummy and that he should question some things from time to time, he doesn't try to make others come to the same conclusion, or even come to any conclusion at all. And this is a driver between the metaphorical conflict between Roger and Schwartzwald. It's not just, I will use my giant robot to take over the world. It's, I will use my giant robot to enlighten the masses. And this in turn creates a moral quandary of the subjective nature of enlightenment, and whether or not it's right to force a metaphorical horse to drink at metaphorical water. In their own eyes, both are justified. Roger simply wants to keep the peace, while Schwartzwald is convinced that he's doing some kind of great community service. He sees a horse that is dying of thirst, and wants to force it to drink for its quote, own good. However, he doesn't really question if that horse is really dying of thirst, or merely a little dehydrated. Roger recognizes this and allows it to drink at its own leisure. Schwartzwald doesn't allow others to question what the good is, he simply establishes an arbitrary benchmark for it, and then tries to force it upon others. And this is a great oversight. While Roger fights Schwartzwald initially out of a professional obligation, and later to protect the innocent people from Schwartzwald's delusional tactics, Schwartzwald's delusional tactics spawn from the desire in his eyes to save humanity. He isn't so much pure evil as deranged and disillusioned, and this both makes him a more complex, and yet somehow more dislikable character on some levels. While we can sympathize for his quest for the truth, we rightfully should question and be disgusted by how his methods play out, and his pretension of saving mankind, a mankind which doesn't even really think it needs saving at the moment, and would rather just go about its own business without some giant robot fight ruining its day. Schwartzwald disregards free will, and while it could be argued that Schwartzwald does not want to force his thoughts so much as force thinking in general, even then he's forcing someone to do something, and that's not right. It's someone's right to think, and it's someone's right to not think, or to choose what thoughts they act upon, isn't it? And therefore it's also the right of the individual to conclude whether or not to seek enlightenment, or even what is enlightenment and their own personal truths, and to what extent they hold these. Schwartzwald's employment of Big Duo is still an employment of force to force something, and the problem of using force is therefore still present and still problematic. This means that Schwartzwald's approach, even if in his eyes justified, is fundamentally flawed, as it means that all his attempts to enlighten others will simply hurt the people that he means to help. But what if someone's will is successfully implanted upon another? What happens then? Well, most of the times, it's not good, and we see this with the fates of the tomatoes. For reference, tomatoes are the people whom Gordon Rosewater gave memories to as youth. There are two examples that we're going to look at to see how this doesn't work out so well. The general cases and that of Alex Rosewater. While the general cases are not really examined too much in depth in the show, we can see that they're generally not happy. We see this when Big Ear comments on how they were bothered by knowing things that realistically they shouldn't, and how that makes others see them as crazy. They never quite fit in, and they never feel quite right, and it's clear that their tomato status has hurt them. Getting murdered for it doesn't help either. Next is Alex Rosewater, and to a lesser extent Roger, two men who struggle to reconcile their life and the memories forced upon them. While both are forced into a crisis of self, which Roger eventually overcomes, both do fall apart for a bit, and we're going to look at Rosewater to see why forcing enlightenment doesn't work even when initially successful. Alex exemplifies the idea of creating an enlightened man from scratch, a man who is given all he needs to be the best boy. And he also shows why this doesn't work. You see, as Gordon's son, Alex is set up as a dominant figure, a man who possesses knowledge of great power, one who is set up to guide the world accordingly. This is all based upon a foundation implanted upon him, however, as he's actually just a tomato and not that special, and all of the views which he bases his entire being upon are not really his own. As mentioned before, this creates a big insecurity for Big Al, and ultimately leads him astray, as it causes him to embark on his great ego quest. When someone is unsure of their beliefs, they start to lash out in weird ways, and Alex is someone who is disturbed by the questionable nature of his status in the world, and the questionable status of his beliefs, as none of these things are things that have come to him naturally or organically. This is someone who lacks their own views to a certain extent, and this shows us how people tend to lose faith in views forced upon them for the same reason, because in the end, if views are forced upon them, you didn't actually obtain them yourself, so you're not likely to be as faithful to them. Alex didn't really work for these views that he has, he didn't really work for his status, and so he always feels kind of uneasy about it. As a result, he lacks character development, and in turn has a crisis of self and falls apart when he realizes that he's kind of built his house on a foundation of sand. He has been enlightened by someone who has determined enlightenment by their own metrics and has pursued it in their own methods, stripping him of both his own enlightenment and his own methods of pursuing his own enlightenment. In order to be enlightened, the individual needs to determine what that is for themselves, and then do whatever they can to work towards it. It cannot be forced on someone, as one needs to use their own views to navigate through daily life. They need to use their own in order to help them properly assess who they are and whether they like their current trajectory in life. People generally struggle to do this with something that isn't their own, however, as it wasn't established by them, and thus is not necessarily very applicable to them even in their own eyes. If you're forcing someone to view the world with a view that isn't actually theirs, you're actually just blinding them. This blindness need not be permanent though, and it is possible to work through it, as demonstrated by the character of Angel, who over the course of the series grows to know herself and not only learn that she is a different version of the person that she thought she was, but also the director, that is the creator of the Big O, who slowly learns to pull herself out of her work and work her way through whatever it is that hampers her in her real life, as the cathartic experiences of venting herself through her artistic expression assist her enough in order to help her get back on her feet and set the Big O world on a brighter trajectory and help her get her life back on track. You see, I've saved this bit of character analysis because I feel that it's important to look at all the other characters in the Big O in order to understand the core of Angel's character. This is for two reasons, those being that A, Angel's character changes throughout the series, and often it does so to reflect changes that are observed or undertaken by other characters, and B, her unique position as the director of the Big O universe confers a unique status upon her, which to truly understand, we need to see how her creations can be reflections of her inner self and her true personality. This director status is of special importance as it means that there is essentially two angels present in the show. There's the angel that is present in the majority of her scenes, that is the modified self-insert of the director, and that there's also the director angel herself, which is seen mostly in the final couple episodes. The self-insert is the angel which consumes most of her screen time, and the director is her true form, which we see in the form of Big Venus and in the writing room. I will use these terms specifically when referring to only one. For now, I just implore you to keep in mind that the self-insert is the one that we tend to see, and that the Big O as a whole is a fantasy creation of the director. Now, in terms of plot significance and role, Angel is kind of all over the place. She's first introduced in episode 3 as a sort of femme fatale Paradigm employee with her own agenda. Eventually this agenda is revealed to be the retrieval of memories for some purpose. She claims it's for money, but it seems instead to be deeply personal. Anyways, as the show progresses, she kind of just appears randomly to usually help or even bail Roger out from time to time, and I will admit some of these instances do feel very random or contrived before we understand her role as a director, but I will go more into that more later. By the Union arc, Angel is shown to be a Union agent who wants to preserve Paradigm as opposed to the Union's goal of destroying it. For this, she is punished and exiled from the Union. She is denounced as a traitor and left to wander the city dejected until eventually winding up in the underground film studio. It is here that Director Angel is first referenced and starts to make her first appearances, as both director and self-insert start to accept the fictional nature of the Big O and the fact that it is an escapist reality constructed by the director. Angel, the director, is realizing that she cannot run forever from whatever it is that's weighing her down and causing her to try and hide inside of her work. This results in the reveal that Angel is a memory and that the self-insert is a manifestation of the director. This leads to the manifestation of the director in universe as Big Venus, and her coming to terms with her own life and her creative ventures comes when Roger delivers one of the best anime speeches of all time. As part of this coming to terms, Angel does not delete the Big O, but instead resets the Big O timeline on a brighter trajectory than what it originally was. And this leads to the biggest and most open-ended unanswered question of Angel's character, which is, what is her kind of truth? What is her goal? What is the point of her character, and why is it important that the Big O is her creation? After 26 episodes of work, Why should we care? Now, all of these, of course, are very valid questions, spurned on by the fact that the Big O's ending is not the most clear cut, and Angel's role is probably one of the most divisive things in the series, especially considering how much of a loop the ending throws many viewers for. It's true that a lot of people may not like Angel because she's the reason the series ended dumb. This isn't true though, and I'd like to say that there are points to everything here, and that the ending of the Big O is, at least in my opinion, not completely dumb. It's not a complete throwaway. Now, in the previous sections, I've explained ad nauseum the need for some kind of personal truth or values or goals or context in order to establish what one wants to do with their life and how to pursue this. I'm not going to repeat those previous segments because it's been done ad nauseum. However, I'd like to think that I've made it clear that God and truth are incomprehensible and subjective. So instead, this is not a dissection of Angel's truth, but her creation, and how her creation is a reflection of who she is as a person. By looking at art, we can see how it imitates life. This is going to be an attempt at trying to learn more about her character based on her creation. And if Paradigm City and its residents are her creations, well, we see a lot of them, and we can learn a lot of her character and in turn her condition from these things. To do so, we must first see how the different characters represent different aspects of her personality, and in turn, how her own struggles and coming to terms with them are reflected throughout the series as a whole. Now, it's clear that the director Angel is someone who is going through some serious struggles at the moment, and we can discern this just from the general feel of the Big O. A lot of the tones and visuals of the series implicate not the brightest tone. It's a little gloomy, it's a little down, and it seems to be very confusing and mysterious. And these all play an important part in getting to her initial layers as a character. We all have struggles, so the specifics here don't really matter because this is more about the concept of surpassing struggles via one's own art. It's more about how Angel overcomes the issues and not the issues themselves. While this is kind of vague and may make her character less relatable, I think it does make this idea more applicable to everyone. It is a view of the human condition and not just Angel's specific condition. So that's why the specifics don't really matter. Getting back to the setting though, the setting is cool, but it's also grimy and grim. It's not the worst, but it's also not the happiest. It's glum and unfair, and it all takes place in a land of confusion, of amnesia, of unclear boundaries and unclear goals. All of this sets up a mental space of someone who is getting by, but isn't very happy, or perhaps not even of the most clear mind. Someone who feels stuck. And this might be due to some traumatic loss, or some other traumatic event, or simply they don't like their job, or some other myriad of potential stumbling blocks that all of us may have. Perhaps it was so bad that it's even subconsciously repressed, and that might manifest in the Big O as the collective amnesia seen throughout Paradigm. Perhaps Angel can't remember what it is that's blocking her, or she just doesn't want to acknowledge it, just like the citizens of Paradigm can't remember or choose not to acknowledge the existence of their own pasts. Next, let's look at how some of the plot contrivances are reflective of Angel's mental state, and perhaps how it's not the most stable. Now, I did mention how earlier Angel seems to appear in some episodes just because, and while that did seem contrived before we knew she was the director, once we know she's the director, everything kind of starts to fall into place. In addition, these contrivances also extend to the plot contrivances connected to Dorothy's character when she seemingly gives up and gets captured from time to time. In a metaphorical sense, we can see that Dorothy's capture kind of represents someone who is captured by their own struggles. Dorothy has the physical power to beat up whoever might be trying to kidnap her, but she cannot get over her mental blocks which allow her to fully utilize her own abilities. Likewise, Angel as the director has a ton of creative power over the Big O universe, but is bogged down by something, and this prevents her from really harnessing or achieving her true vision, at least until the end of the series. In a more concrete and literal sense, this could also be a reflection of Angel struggling as a writer. Perhaps she's failing to reconcile the subversion of a damsel in distress with the need for Roger to rescue a damsel in distress. Dorothy is that subversion, seeing how she's very physically strong, but Roger is still the main character, and, well, maybe he needs to rescue a damsel in distress according to her script. As such, she attempts to reconcile this by placing her self-insert character into the role of the damsel in distress in the place of Dorothy. She backs off this, however, as real-life Angel, the director, realizes that she's burying herself into her work too much, and that her self-insert has gone from a neat little cameo to something that she's emotionally invested in to an unhealthy extent, inside of her own fictional creation. She's getting too attached to her work, and it's distracting her from the world around her. She's losing touch with reality. Now, of course, it's okay to be invested in fiction, that's perfectly fine. However, Angel's getting too invested out of an attempt to run away from her personal issues in the real world. However, her work and her creative expression do help her reflect upon this, and she grows more as a result of this, ultimately no longer running away and deciding to restart the Big O in a better light. This explains the odd back and forth she has with Roger, and in the end, Angel implies that Roger should choose Dorothy because as the director, she realizes that she cannot fix or run away from her real life issues by obsessing over her own work and her self-insert. She's leaving the escapist fantasy that she has created, and in the process of doing so, coming to terms with things in the real world. And we see this in the conclusion. As a result, however, Dorothy is kind of forced in the plot contrivances from time to time, as the conflict that needs to be resolved, the need to rescue a damsel in distress versus Dorothy's own physical power, was originally going to be resolved by Angel's self-insert. However, it can no longer be cleanly fixed because Angel has realized that she needs to pull herself out of her work. However, I do think that this is still a neat reflection of Angel's mental state, as it shows that she isn't quite thinking clearly and struggling to get the production done. While the Big O's writing, at least its plot structure, can be somewhat rightfully criticized as not necessarily super coherent or fleshed out, I do think that this is a nice little caveat to say that, guys, it's not entirely weird writing, it's also an expression of the confusion of the mental stupor of the director herself, which in turn can be seen as a sort of reflection of the confusion or lack of vision or lack of concrete direction in a production team that had no idea when they were getting canceled, and thus feared long overarching plots which might not conclude before they ran out of money. Getting back to the supporting cast though, as Angel's creations, they are all manifestations of certain feelings and impulses that Angel the director has. We can learn a lot about her character by looking at them as people. Datsun is a brave and honorable man, and yet he seems powerless and overworked. Angel the director is an executive of a title, and a creation all her own which she lords over, and yet she struggles to rein in her creation and even live her own life. Berg is productive, but he's also very quiet and often hidden. Angel the director doesn't make her presence felt as a character until the near end of the series, when she finally realizes that she needs to be more productive and pull herself out of her own escapist fantasy. Dorothy is snarky and obviously human, but also comes off as disconnected and at times dejected. Angel the director is someone who feels withdrawn and isolated, burying herself in her own creation. Gabriel is a nihilist who just wants to burn everything down. Angel is clearly dealing with the struggles of feeling empty and seeing the point in her life, or at least her work, and openly questions just destroying it all at the end of the series. Schwartzwald obsesses over truth, but never really finds it until it's too late to really matter. Angel seems to be living in a state of deep uncertainty, searching for herself, unaware of the fact that her actions and state of being now are also important. Gordon Rosewater sees remembering as useless and has essentially given up on it. Alex Rosewater wants to scrap everything and start anew with complete control. Angel, like many dealing with serious struggles, also seems to crave a fresh start with an excessive amount of control, even if that's not necessarily realistic or healthy. And finally, there is Roger. Roger is the part of her which pushes her to survive and eventually evolve. He is a manifestation of the primordial and ever-present energy seen in all life, which pushes it to get by, the survival instinct, the fighting spirit, if you will. Roger is not a quitter, and as the main character of the show, he manifests the human will to fight and overcome. He is an idealized embodiment of this, but he is still an embodiment of the unbeatable drive to survive. He is tough, but is not crude. He does things his own way, but is also a gentleman about it. Perhaps this is why Angel loves this creation of hers so much, because it's something she longs to embrace. It's something she strives to be. She wants to be someone who can take such confidence in their own visions and agency that they will go out of their way to make their own path in life and succeed in it. It is something that anyone who has any serious struggle would want to embrace, because as humans, we want to embrace our inner strength and overcome our inner turmoil, even if we may be buried under negative emotions which may seem contradictory to that. The idea that we should embrace our inner agency in order to live our best lives is something pushed forward by both our base instincts and our evolved sensibilities. And it is this drive to survive, to thrive, which eventually breaks Angel out of her stupor and helps her improve her headspace. It helps her come to terms with whatever it is she's struggling with, and it is a drive that we should all embrace. A drive to do whatever we must do, but to do things in our own way and in a respectful manner. To be ourselves and harness our inner agency to live our best lives in accordance with our own ideals. But all of this forgets one key character, doesn't it? That's right, Angel herself shows up quite a bit before episode 24, and the evolution of her self-insert can be seen as an evolution of both her self-view and an expression of the grief cycle. As mentioned earlier, Angel has a seeming smorgasbord of random and important appearances that don't necessarily make sense in context early on. And while at first they may seem a bit contrived, all of Angel's random day-saving appearances start to make sense when we realize that it's a writer having a self-insert moment to feel better. It's her fantasizing about some life that she'd like to live, or at least a life that isn't the one she currently lives. And this is a manifestation of the first stage of grief, which is denial. In her early appearances, Angel is the cool femme fatale. She's someone who seems to be in complete control, who knows everything, and who always gets what she wants. Like anyone going through a serious event, Angel at first denies that there is a serious event, in an attempt to shield herself from the pain of loss. As the show progresses, however, she grows impatient with Paradigm and her quest and progress and the general state of affairs. And this is a hint at anger. People often grow angry and frustrated when continual issues hamper them. And Angel might be frustrated by her inability to either get the show growing in the direction that she wants to, or by some other big life event that is hurting her at the moment. By the arrival of the Union, we see Angel start to bargain. She's bargaining with Vera to let Paradigm survive and in turn leave her alone. She tries desperately and unrealistically to maintain the sort of escapist status quo she has thrown herself into. People that often go through a loss will often say, if I just fix this, or if I just do that, perhaps I can soften the blow or re-establish new terms or something in order to get through my struggles. Oftentimes, that's not how the real world works, however, and Angel does learn this. Before she does, though, episode 24 sees Angel collapse over her existence and its own uncertainty, and this is the crisis of self that almost results in the destruction of her own creation. She's lashing out in fury and fear and grief and taking it out on the very thing that she tried to use to escape her pain, but realized that it couldn't. This is a manifestation of grief, and it is manifested in universe as the self-insert is beat and eventually becomes Big Venus and tries to wipe the slate clear. This is giving up. This is depression. This is something anyone who has had great loss knows. The world feels so heavy that one loses themselves in it. They give up. But there is hope, as shown in the final episode, when Angel embraces who she is, and while resetting the timeline, ensures that it is a brighter one and that it continues. She doesn't scrap everything. She decides to just move on in a new direction. She has moved on from whatever has troubled her, and this is the conclusion of the secondary plot, that of the Director Angel overcoming her own issues via the self-insertation into her own creation. The Big O is her creation, and it helps her reflect upon not only her own feelings, but also herself and what her goals are in life, and this ample reflection eventually helps her come to terms, and that is acceptance. You see, Angel uses the fictional world she has created to escape from a real world she doesn't feel like facing at the moment. It is a form of escape for her. However, and you can tell this from her self-insert, it's not an entirely effective method of self-escape, as even in her art, she starts to reflect upon her own self and her own pain, as her self-insert character continues to hold doubt and be afraid. In fact, the self-insert's own character growth is a great reflection of Angel's character growth. It reflects a pattern of similar issues in the director. Art is imitating life. Since this is her escape, however, and she hasn't quite come to terms with it, she stays in-universe, mentally, until the end when she finally has collected herself enough to realize that she cannot escape the past, but she can make her own future. Angel does learn this. She does learn to accept her past, and this is shown by Roger's speech to Big Venus, which concludes with, "You must stop denying your own existence. You have a life to live as a human being." And this could be thought of the director telling herself these words, or maybe someone close to her doing so. It doesn't really matter, as the point is that she has internalized them. She's taken them to heart and realized, yes, she has to keep living, and she's got to make her own life, and she has to look out for herself and live her best life. And that is the point at which the director comes to terms and realizes that there is still much to do and much life to live. She decides to give it another go and carry on. And this is the universe reset. This is her resetting her life. Not only has she decided to set the Big O on a brighter trajectory, but also her own life as well. And I think that's why Angel is a subtly inspirational character, even if, again, she is, quote, the reason the series ended dumb. And now, I also want to take a brief second to talk about how Angel's development and character kind of serve as a meta-commentary on the Big O's production and in the creative process as a whole. The entire show was never the most famous or had the biggest budget. In fact, from a zoomed-out point of view, you could even say that the Big O is kind of a massive failure, as the creative team knew that funding could dry up at any time, and none of the other ventures in other mediums really took off either. There's a manga, which I didn't know existed until after watching this. There's a few video game cameos, which again, very obscure. Like Angel, the production and the entire Big O conglomerate, I guess, was always in a state of flux, floating around here and there and unsure of what it wanted to be or where it was going to go. It struggled to really set out a large concrete plot because it didn't know if it would exist long enough to do so. It struggled with truths that it could change, and those that it couldn't, like getting cancelled. Twice. Yet instead of giving up and conceding that this series would never really succeed or be the most well-known or even get fully produced, there is no conventional rushed ending that is forced upon the series and explains everything in an unsatisfactory manner. Instead, the production team went out on their own terms. I say this knowing that this probably wasn't the intended end for the series, and that there might not have even been one. And yet, even on the fly, they crafted a very fitting and unique conclusion that is a great reflection on the creative process as a whole. Instead of discarding the Big O as a failed multimedia venture, they embraced the theme of the Big O, and that people have agency and can craft their own fate regardless of past circumstances, that there are no true endings, and that everything goes on. The production team decided that instead of lamenting a universe which never really got off the ground, they instead will push forwards towards an equally unknown but brighter future. In fact, Director Angel, to me at least, feels like a stand-in for all the people who put so much time and effort into this masterpiece. These are people who probably went through a lot of pains and a lot of questioning to get this thing off the ground, knowing that it would never be that successful and it might not even reach a fully concluded state. Through Angel, we can see the pains that come with the creative process, with missed deadlines, with seeming obscurity, and with cuts that had to be made in order just to get the thing out. And yet we also see the great joy and catharsis that can come with just exploring one's own passions and creative pursuits, from exploring one's own truths and reflecting upon them through their own creative expression. This lets Angel serve as a stand-in and as an inspiration, not just for the creators of the Big O, but for anyone who wants to create anything, from a big production to a small YouTube channel. I think this is why I like Angel's character so much, because it's a beautiful testament to how beautiful the series is from a creative standpoint. I don't mean to say that there's a lot of creative stuff going on here, I mean there definitely is, but the fact that the people who wrote this had fun with it, or at least to me seemed like they had fun with it, and were perfectly okay with it just being what it ended up being. Because although it did start off as a commercial venture, it became something more. It became a weird, obscure anime memory renowned for its bizarre ending and the fact that the production team said, yeah, we're just gonna do that. And I love that about it so much, that it was so bold to just throw caution to the wind and take such a unique stance and truly embrace art for the sake of art, even if it wasn't intended to be from the very start. As with many dystopian and psychological animes, the themes of the Big O are often those reflecting on the nature of humanity when the chips are down, and the personal growth, both positive and negative, that can be spurned on by such situations. The most surface level manifestation of these character growth patterns are how characters deal with the past, and this is a very surface level but important theme of the show. It's a key element of the show, as Paradigm City is the city with no memory, where the past is nothing more than a nebulous concept, and it takes the amnesia trope of noir to the extreme by ensuring that everyone has some kind of collective amnesia. This in turn negates a lot of what many dislike about the amnesia trope, that it's a cheap way of creating drama and tension. Instead, it creates a mystery which grabs onto the viewer's attention and helps them pull them in. More importantly, it also allows the viewer to see a variety of ways of dealing with the past, how different methods can be more or less effective and have positive or negative impacts on one's own life. It shows us the merits or demerits of different approaches, and all of these fall on a spectrum ranging from complete disregard for the past to complete obsession with it. On one extreme is Alan Gabriel, a seemingly complete nihilist who longs only for chaos. He also sees the past as pointless, going so far as to deny its existence. He states that there are no memories, implying there's no past, or at the very least that none of it matters to him. Now, whether he has this view because he's always been a nihilist or because he specifically wants to forget his past is not specified, although both probably ring true to some extent. While this is a manifestation of his nihilism, he does have some points that we should briefly gloss over. As to Alan Gabriel, the only time we should live in is the present. To him, the past should provide no influences or context on how we live our lives, and thus is kind of pointless and should be disregarded completely. Disregard of the past connects to his disregard of the present, though, as he has no real connections to other characters of the world and seems only to serve himself. He does what he wants regardless of context, and this disregard for everything means that he ultimately ends up disregarding himself, which is the drawback to completely denying the past, as if we cannot learn from our own mistakes, we're bound to make them again. Now, memories and one's own past do not completely define a person, but they are important in order to provide the canvas on which a person will paint their self-portrait. As without a portrait of himself, Alan cannot evolve as a person and essentially refuses to grow. He doesn't struggle, he refuses to, and he stagnates, and as such his character doesn't really do anything when we really look at it in a character growth sense. He doesn't have a character arc, he just kind of has a character line. This isn't a person who struggles to grow due to a grave setback or issue. This is someone who refuses to struggle at all. Someone who, out of pure obstinance, has simply decided that, no, I'm not going to try today, and instead he only feeds his own hedonistic desires. As such, he doesn't really accomplish anything or serve any goal, and in the end he is punished for this as the big duo deems him guilty and takes care of him. His refusal to attach any significance to the past is the foundation of his refusal to attach significance to anything, and without a future, without a goal, without a certain point to pursue, he revels in pointless violence and is eventually punished for it. However, that's not to say that the past is something to be completely obsessed over, as on the other end of the spectrum is Schwartzwald, a man who obsesses over the past and yearns for the true timeline of the events which came before and possibly caused the amnesia of the city. This is his quest, to learn of and understand the past as much as he can. It is because he needs to know the foundations of the world, a desire very common to humanity, to know where one comes from and to help guide them where they might go. He realizes that without a foundation, without context, it's very difficult to decide where one wants to go and pursue healthy goals in a healthy manner. However, his need for a past to help him think has gotten to the point of detriment. He thinks that he needs the past in order for himself to think. He doesn't realize that if he bases all of his thoughts, all of his goals, all of his truths solely on what's happened on the past, they're set upon a very narrow foundation, are thus ironically limited by what it is that he seeks to help him think. As his search for the perfect canvas on which to paint himself consumes so much of him that he never actually gets around to completing his self-portrait. I mean, Schwartzwald definitely changes, he definitely has character growth, but his obsession over the past blinds himself to his family, to his life, to himself, i.e., his growth has not been for the best. He's consumed by what is essentially a wild goose chase, while knowing his own past might help him decide what he wants to do with his life and in what directions to grow and teach him some valuable lessons. It's not going to help him live in the present. In fact, he's obsessing over the past so much that he basically can't live in the present, and that of course is not good either. That's not to say that knowing or pursuing the past is stupid or pointless, however, and Schwartzwald's approach does remind the viewer of the need to question things and to reflect upon things which have happened previously in our lives, and that these things do matter, and that context is often important for determining who one is and who wants to be. It's just that that's not the be-all end-all, but for Schwartzwald it is, and this approach takes over his life and ruins it. I mean, he's still capable of kind of functioning, but he doesn't really live. Instead, he's consumed by an overwhelming obsession to know things which realistically won't really affect him much by this point. He cannot change the past and cannot literally live in it or alter it. His quest, though, does alter him, for the worst, essentially destroying his life and proving that obsessing over the past is also a disastrous approach to it. With these extremes of the spectrum explored, let's now see what's in between. Angel and Alex serve as lesser versions of Alan and Schwartzwald respectively. Alan acknowledges the past, but tries to forcefully override it, and Angel's obsessed with the past, but not to the point of completely being consumed by this obsession. In the center, slowly moving from disregarding the past to seeing it as somewhat important, is Roger Smith, who takes a very pragmatic view of things. As mentioned earlier, at the start of the series, he's mostly fine with not acknowledging the past and openly ignores it. In fact, one of his early rules is to ignore any such memories because they, quote, get in the way of things. He sees these as a distraction from what's happening today, and he is a man who wants to live in today, in the moment. He lives by his truth that today is today, and, well, that's where we live. This starts to change, however, when he meets Schwartzwald. Schwartzwald brings up the flaw in Roger's worldview that he doesn't really know why he is the way he is, or how he really got here. While Roger is more practical and tends not to question the larger concepts of the world around him, it is true that he can't always contextualize himself due to his open disregard for the history of the world. And this in turn limits him to an extent and makes him seem a little oddly empty or disconnected from the world. In addition, it makes Roger seem like an incomplete person, Like, he still has great potential for the greater good, but he doesn't openly acknowledge this because he's kind of afraid of who he really is. And part of him denying his past is him denying the possibility that he's not who he thinks he is, that he might just be some scrub. However, as Roger evolves over the series, he realizes that there is some need for some context in life. He grows a little too dependent on this, however, as for a bit, he's consumed by his lack of past and the idea that maybe he is not as good as he thinks he is because he can't prove that there's some past event that led him to where he is now. However, as the series progresses, he comes to a healthy compromise. He comes to terms as he knows that regardless of the past, he cannot go and live in it, and he can only live in the present, and that he must live in today. But who he is today is a person who has been shaped by what has happened in the past, and he does acknowledge that some context is an important foundation for establishing where we want to go in the future. Roger has become someone who in turn carries on the impact of the past and then the present, but someone who also marches towards the future, and therefore be the best embodiment of himself today. Dorothy, being an android, also creates a really neat way to analyze the concepts of memory. Since she is an android, her memories are seen in a more physical and tangible way, like discs and such. While Dorothy is subject to the collective amnesia of Paradigm, the fact that her memory is physical makes her perspective on the topic much more visceral. It can be physically handled and altered. I would also like to say that her evolution shows the need to overcome the past controlling who we are, or who we think we are, as initially Dorothy is completely defined by her past. Her purpose was in fact to recreate a specter of someone who's long dead and physically embody them. She lives under the terrifying cloud that her purpose and goal in life were pre-decided for her, and that it was pre-decided that these would simply be the purpose and goals of someone else's life. And this strips her of a lot of agency early on, and it in turn makes her lose a little bit of faith in herself. She literally and metaphorically cannot function without her past, without her memories, as in a physical sense she just shuts down, but on a metaphorical sense, since she was told that she's always going to be someone else, or that she's supposed to be someone else, she starts off as a blank slate. However, as the series progresses, she becomes more in touch with her humanity, and she overcomes the dreary thought of merely being a relic, and she becomes her own self. She overcomes the shackles of the past, both literally and figuratively, breaking them. Note how Dorothy doesn't even need her memory by the end of the series, as she transcends the physical and figurative chains of the past. And this is what the Big O is telling us, that while the past is important for how it has shaped us and what we can learn from it, it doesn't stop us from shaping ourselves today, and that it doesn't determine our futures. In fact, Dorothy's creation of essentially an entirely new identity which she firmly embraces and takes peace in is one of the most impressive character feats of any anime that I've seen in a while, at least on a psychological front, because she has gone from someone constructed and told to be something and someone completely different than what she ends up being after that previous installment of her identity is taken from her. For this reason, Dorothy's story is a subtly inspirational one, and one that sets her apart as one of the best anime characters of all time, at least in my opinion. As if anime is all about growth, Dorothy is one of the anime characters that grows the most in every way possible, since she starts off as essentially a completely blank slate, but ends up being a very iconic and memorable character with her own distinct identity by the end of the Big O. For that reason, I've saved her character analysis for the end of this retrospective, as I think it's probably the strongest one to end on, and my favorite. It's now time we look at the android that started it all, R. Dorothy Wainwright. Now, Dorothy is of course a fan favorite of the series, and it's very obvious as to why. On a surface level, her very blunt, sarcastic, and intelligent writing creates a character which is the quintessential sarcastic partner, someone with good intentions, but is still going to judge everyone involved. On a deeper level though, Dorothy has a very complex and inspiring arc about forging one's own identity when it seems like there isn't anything to really work with, and about deciding who you want to be and using your abilities to do so in spite of the fact that there may seem to be crushing pressure at times, in spite of the fact you may feel like giving up sometimes. She is very endearing to the audience for both of these reasons, as on a surface level she does say the funny lines, but on a deeper character level, she embodies an inspiring presence which shows that in spite of the harsh circumstances one might find themselves in, they can still forge their own identity. And I think these are why she's a fan favorite. Before we go more into depth though, let's see how she fits into the plot itself. Our Dorothy Wainwright is introduced in the first episode as the kidnappee which Roger Smith must negotiate a release for. After this negotiation goes awry, however, Roger kinda concludes the case done with. I mean, he did technically secure her escape, although the loose ends still nag at him. And he eventually decides to learn more of our Dorothy Wainwright and finds out that she is living with her grandfather, Timothy Wainwright, the man who built her. He did this to take the place of his biological granddaughter. Dorothy is not that daughter, and this leads to a personal conflict that she resolves throughout the course of the series. However, Timothy cannot be part of this, as once Roger meets both of them, Timothy is killed in an altercation shortly afterwards, and Dorothy has her memory drive taken in order to jury-rig a giant mech used by Beck to steal this mint. This spurs Roger into action, rescuing Dorothy and retrieving her memory core and stopping Beck. Dorothy, of course, is grateful for this, and apparently having no money, she decides to pay off her debt to Roger with labor. This sets up Dorothy to be around the Smith estate, and in turn join Roger on many of his adventures, becoming a key character in the show. I would say probably the second most important overall, after Roger, of course. She does rescue Roger on several occasions, and serves as a kind of rock for him, as shown in several episodes, especially 14 and 26. She even develops feelings for him, but is initially rebuffed. By the start of the Union plot, the two have grown closer in many ways, and her memory core is once again stolen. Roger once again sets out to rescue her. However, she ends up rescuing Roger, as she has now managed to function without her memory bank, as her agency and humanity are confirmed by this triumph, and she no longer needs it to function. In the final scenes, she is side by side with Roger inside of the Big O as he defeats Big Foul and later talks down Angel. With this out of the way, let's get into her character examination. Getting back to the surface level mentioned earlier, many people find the sarcastic type endearing as they will, quote, say what everyone is thinking. When we first meet her, she lacks tact and will simply say what she means and mean what she says. There is more to this character below the surface though. In fact, I would say that of all the characters in the series, Dorothy is the closest to having any kind of tragic arc or air to it. I don't think she's a tragic character, but her character is definitely not the happiest, or at least when we first meet her. However, it is one which sees great growth, and depending on how you interpret the ending of the series, one which does have a very happy ending. All of these explain why a lot of people like her, because she is someone who's blunt and sarcastic, but someone who also grows along the way while being blunt and sarcastic. It's not always that we ask why a sarcastic and blunt character is the way they are, and in this case it's not just because she's an android. In fact, the Big O goes out of its way to show that androids are very much human in every regard save the physical. In characters like Art Instro, Roscoe Fitzgerald, Big Ear, and several others, we see that the androids of the series are very much human. They don't really exhibit any classic robot or android character tropes that we would see in older science fiction, per se. That's not to say Dorothy isn't human, and she exhibits many of her traits due to a lack of humanity. In fact, I think she is very much human, and that her sarcastic and blunt nature are human manifestations of a possible inner sadness. Her humanity should not be questioned here. Instead, we should explore how it manifests and how it evolves over time. The manifestation are why I think she's a bit tragic when we first meet her, and her evolution is why I think she's inspiring later. You see, while sarcasm can be the result of an intentional effort at comedy, the kind that Dorothy exudes when we first meet her, often the kind audience like, is often a result of some kind of disconnect. It can be a coping method, and in this case it most likely is. At the start of the series, Dorothy comes off as very disconnected from the world around her, although in a very subtle way, in addition to a very literal way. In a literal way, she is an android in a world of humans. Yes, there are others like her, but most of them are not as advanced, and they are an obvious minority here. In addition, she's literally severed from the only family she's known up until this point, when Timothy is taken from her. On a more emotional level, Dorothy isn't violent or rude, but she is very obviously disconnected and apathetic. It's not that she can't understand humanity because it's too weak, she cannot be bothered to because it's actually quite strong, and the emotions that come with it are driving her to kind of isolate herself. And this hints at a sadness, this massive apathy. This sadness in turn probably originates from several main places. First off, Dorothy is acutely aware of the fact that she's not actually like the real Dorothy, the biological one, but rather a, quote, nightingale meant to serve as a duplicate for a dead biological woman. She knows that she wasn't created to be herself per se, but to be someone else. And she's very blunt and open and aware about this. Secondly, just as it seems that she's adapting to this and even learning to enjoy her role as Dorothy with her grandfather, this too is taken away from her when Timothy is tragically killed, leaving her on her own. All of these circumstances leave Dorothy lacking both a sense of self, i.e. an original identity, and a sense of context, i.e. a role or context to frame herself in. She is a completely blank slate, so to speak, and this is an exceedingly rare state for a full-grown adult to be in, and it is now up to her to determine who she wants to be, and how to shape herself into that woman. This, combined with the shock of her recent losses, sets up any characters to start off as a bit withdrawn and sad, android or not. Withdrawal from the world is a very natural struggle for many people dealing with loss or depression. It is a coping mechanism for not wanting to feel pain again. The fact that Dorothy does feel all of this pain and copes in this way proves her humanity, even if the early cinematography goes out of its way to emphasize how mechanical she is physically. And this becomes her story and her character's focal point, climbing out of loss, determining who she wants to be, and then more openly expressing that person and her humanity along the way. She has a lot of ups and downs, and even comes close to giving up at times. For example, there are instances when she seemingly allows herself to be harmed or captured, like during the Union arc. A small tangent, I do find instances like this interesting from a logistical point of view, from a writing perspective, as they can be seen as either great or terrible examples of writing, and I'll elaborate on that now. It could be great writing, as her struggles and her giving up show us just how difficult figuring out who you are can be, as while someone may seem fine on the surface, they may not be on the inside, and a lot of turmoil can erupt from people not quite knowing who they are yet. And people can hide this and hide what they truly feel, and sometimes even have great struggles that may want to make them give up, all under the surface. This would make Dorothy seemingly putting herself in harm's way excellent insights into the difficulty of shaping oneself and dealing with loss, especially when doubt abounds and nothing seems certain. When someone is figuring out who they are with no clear guidance for others, it can be quite challenging navigating loss and sadness, as this is a day-by-day kind of thing. Sometimes there are good days and sometimes there are bad things, and it takes time and support to fully come to terms with such things, to fully identify who you are as a person, although it is possible, even if we may want to give up at times. However, instances of Dorothy seemingly giving up could also be seen as weak writing, as if we look at it from a practical point of view, it can feel a bit contrived for times. Sometimes it seems like the writers really did say, okay, we need Dorothy to get captured to move the plot along, but they realized they kind of wrote themselves into a corner because she is established to be way stronger and faster than an average human is. She would be very capable of defending herself should she choose to. So it could be argued that her having a moment is a contrived way to get her captured, because if she wasn't, realistically, she wouldn't be, and that could lead to plot issues later on. The idea that her emotional moments are contrived boil down to her having emotional moments for the sake of plot convenience. I think both are possible, though I tend to lean towards the idea that Dorothy's emotional moments are genuine manifestations of humanity and character development. Although I do also think that they are great ways to justify plot contrivances when it does seem a little contrived from time to time. I remember thinking this especially in episode 22 or 23 when she gets captured, just saying to myself, wow, she could have gotten away, but I guess she does have reason to be upset. And this also may fit into Angel's place in the story. Like anyone else on any kind of great journey of self-discovery though, Dorothy experiences setbacks while doing this, as anyone would. Her interpersonal skills start off as very cold and rusty, and although she is by no means gregarious by the end of the series, she's definitely much improved in this regard. She also struggles with her strongly implied feelings for Roger Smith. This is brought up in episode 9 when she asks Roger if she would have fallen in love with him had they no memories, to which Roger initially responds with the old, what? Quick aside, I do think that there is room for debate if this was intended to be a serious or throwaway line, as this is exactly what happened to Mr. Weiss, so there is context for this question coming up, and someone could think that she's just teasing him or trying to have an objective philosophical conversation. I don't think that this is entirely the case though, and I think this was meant to be somewhat serious, as it is a thread throughout the series that Dorothy is implied to have feelings for Roger, and it is mentioned increasingly throughout the series, and as the series progresses, Dorothy does seem to fixate on it a bit from time to time. In fact, in episode 18, she goes as far as to call Roger the man she loves, to his face, although walks it back when again it seems like it didn't quite land. Again, there can be some debate here, as episode 18 is the comedy episode, although I do think it consistent enough with both the writing and character of Dorothy throughout the series to be considered a serious statement. The implied feelings between the two go on to shape the ending of the series, and perhaps explain why she seems distraught at times, as she would be distraught that the man she's so close to doesn't even view her as human when we begin the series. However, while Roger's initial seeming lack of interest is disappointing to Dorothy, she eventually decides that she still respects him and will stick by him, and will still stick by his side in some capacity, because she wants to. And Their feelings evolve into a mutual respect for each other and more. I do think it quite ironic though that for as blunt of a character as Dorothy is, it's a bit difficult to get to her core character. Although, if I had to summarize this entire thing, I would say that she is a woman, saddened by both her initial lack of original identity and context and loss, and sarcasm is her way of dealing with this. However, since she is a logical woman and likes to look at things head on, she does look at things head on, and eventually slowly starts to shape who she wants to be after realizing that she was created to be someone else, but that someone else is not her. She begins to look at things head on and doesn't run away from the truths around her, but begins to make her own. And this is a subtle foil to Roger, as he initially runs away from his past, while Dorothy looks bluntly at it and then decides to shape her own identity based upon the facts that she's aware of. And as time goes on, all of this becomes part of who she is, and who she is evolves and grows as she determines who she wants to be and in what directions to grow. All of this comes from the same base that she started with though, from almost nothing, and it is an impressive exploit in character creation. She had a great internal challenge, she had a great lack of identity, and even though it seems like she wanted to give up from time to time, she does an admirable job forging who she is by the end of the series. First tapping into her own humanity, and then determining how to use that humanity to exercise her final human form, if you will. While Dorothy is a subtly tragic character, she's also a subtly inspirational one. She constructs herself and to an extent her own goals and truths and views in a very humble and healthy way, much more so than say Rosewater. Where Rosewater has a truth and doesn't like it and tries to bend the world around her to change this, Dorothy adjusts herself and approaches her setbacks logically. She knows that she must adapt to her own new life and setting and role, and does so to the best of her efforts. She may not know who she is initially, but she grows to know who she is. However, she does not try to assert herself over others. She doesn't step on others, but she doesn't let their opinions get in the way either. Where Alex does everything to prove a single point, Dorothy starts off as a person who's lost every point, and then does an admirable job making her own. She embarks on a slow but steady pace of character growth, and along with her obvious emotions, proves her humanity. Yes, she is disconnected and apathetic at times, but she overcomes all of this, and as the series progresses, lives her own life more and more. Yes, Roger did give her the old what when she brings up her feelings with him the first time, but she doesn't let that hold her down. Plus, it's implied she might have changed his mind by the end of the series. Speaking of which, by the end of the series, Dorothy has essentially made her own self, and those close to her cherish her for who she has made herself, and not who she was made to be. And having just talked about that person that she's made herself to be, that is Dorothy, we have concluded the character analysis of this retrospective and are nearing its conclusion. However, before we come to terms with the end of this retrospective, there's one last theme that I'd like to address very quickly, because we're about to talk about one of the biggest themes of the Big O, in fact, probably its biggest theme, at least in my eyes, and that is the importance of making one's own truth and asserting what one's truth means to them. Now, this is definitely one of the biggest topics of the Biggest O, but since it's been brought up ad nauseum by this point, this is just going to be a short and sweet synopsis of it. You see, in the Big O and life in general, truth is not simply objective. It comes from core values, context, and many other things that people can determine as important, and it's what people hold on to. These core values, these core goals, these core beliefs, and everything else that forms a truth are important because they guide someone in their life path and form a foundation of a person's worldview and how they want to live their life. These, and the forms they take, and the actions they elicit, will vary in many ways across different people, but the need for a foundation is present in everyone. People need to have their own truth and hold it dear, and perhaps modify it as they learn more about the world, but nonetheless have something to guide them and help them reason their way through the world. A person's truth is a sort of raison d'etre, and the importance of a raison d'etre, or reason for being, is a greater purpose which can motivate someone to truly accomplish whatever it is that they seek to do. By establishing their own truths, the characters can establish their own raison d'etre, and prove why it's important not just for them, but for us as well. However, if we all must seek our own truth, then it goes without saying that we should also respect the truth of those around us. And this is why, although the Big O promoting the idea of a truth may seem a little dangerous because people might be inclined to beliefs detrimental to everyone around them, like Alex Rosewater, the Big O goes out of its way to say that it's important not to pursue such negative truths. That while what one's raison d'etre can be a myriad of things, it should not negatively impact the raison d'etre of those around us. And we see this in the fact that Schwartzwald and Alex Rosewater, characters with not very good raison d'etres or characters that don't act on their raison d'etre in a positive manner, are punished for it. This is the big O warning against us giving us a truth which is overall a destructive one, or one with negative consequences for both the wielder and those around them. I want to add this little caveat just to say that the Big O is not promoting that someone cling to radical beliefs, but instead to say that we must anchor ourselves with some kind of greater purpose in order to help motivate us to achieve the best versions of ourselves that we can be. Truth can be made for one, and it can be solely derived from a single purpose, or it can be made from many and derived from many possible sources. It's up to the individual to choose what parts of what truths they see around them and incorporate it into their own, and perhaps even lend parts of their own to someone else's. It's up for the individual to see where they lie in the world and chase the truth they hold the highest, as doing so forms a reason for being, and that is a purpose for existing, whether it's a literal or a very metaphysical one. It helps everyone to have some kind of reason to be, some kind of greater goal or purpose, and it does help validate an individual. It doesn't have to be the largest thing. It could be a simple task like being a good parent or even person, or just getting your bills paid. It doesn't need to be grand in the eyes of everyone, so long as it's grand enough in your eyes and gives you enough purpose to help you grow as a person from it. It's one of the beauties of truth that almost everyone can derive purpose from it, and yet it can be derived from almost anything else in exchange. It gives people drive, and this drive pits them against reality, forcing them to adapt to a world and in turn grow as a person, or perhaps change the world for better, or unfortunately worse. And we see this with all the characters in the Big O. Roger's raison d'etre is to serve the people as a negotiator, and this installs in him a code which ultimately sees him through to the conclusion of the series. Dan Datsun's raison d'etre is to be a cop, and this forces him to grow resilient and tough so that he can deal with the scum of the city. Schwartzwald's raison d'etre is to try and illuminate the masses, and even if he does embrace it so completely to a delusional extent, and this changes him for the worse, it's still something which drives him and makes him a, if unlikable, then very interesting character. Alex Rosewater is similar in that while his truth drives him to bad things, it still is a foundation of who he is as a person. Again, it should be noted that Alex Rosewater and Schwartzwald don't choose the best ways of carrying out their raison d'etre or best raison d'etres in general, and are punished for it, which is an excellent warning against putting something first which probably shouldn't be first. Dorothy starts off as someone without a truth, and establishing her own kind of becomes a raison d'etre in and of itself. The point here is that all of these raisons d'etre cause all of these different characters to grow in their own ways, and spurning a serious raison d'etre can be seen as a critical weakness, as exhibited by Alan Gabriel. Those who don't see a point in anything often lack focus, and often may struggle to tackle the rigors of life as best they can, because they lack a focal point on which to focus those efforts. That doesn't mean that lacking a truth is a critical flaw, however. In fact, Dorothy's character arc kind of proves that you can make your own, and that there is nothing wrong without having one from the start. In fact, most people don't, and it's up to you to determine what that is as you evolve throughout your lifetime. However, what the Big O does state is that those that openly spurn any kind of truth, that is, choose to live without any sort of goal at the expense of others, will often be punished for their failure to utilize their skills and talents, as seen by Alan. Alan is not punished because he lacks the truth, but because he instead disdains the idea of ever having one, and seeks only to serve his violent whims. The Big O has shown that lacking a raison d'etre is not a grievous character flaw, but instead an opportunity for growth to be addressed. This is proven by Dorothy. Ironically, while the Big O may give off an air of nihilism and doom and gloom, its message is inherently opposed to these things, as it says anyone can assign a point to anything and give life meaning from this seemingly arbitrary wellspring. Anyone can create and pursue their own truth, even in a world where it seems like nothing could be proven true or false objectively, in a world without a past, and not even a solid form of reality. Even in spite of this, anyone can make something of themselves from almost nothing, and that's why we all need to establish our own truths, so that we can make and establish our own codes and ideals, and grow as people along the way, so that we can grow into the people we were truly meant to be, and to grow into the best examples of ourselves. Well folks, after several years of publishing stuff on this channel, it's once again time we wrap up our retrospective on the Big O. And first off, I just want to thank everyone who takes time out of their days to watch these videos. I know the channel's not that big, but it really is nice seeing that my little passion project does bring some joy to a few people every now and again over the years. For the first point of order, I feel like this retrospective has been a good overview of the Big O. I feel like it's completed what it was meant to. I always remembered loving the Big O, yet was always confused why no one spoke of it that much on YouTube or in general. Since I made my first video on it, I've seen more topics related to it come up on YouTube. I don't know if that's because I made a video about it that kind of took off, by my standards at least, or because the algorithm just showed me stuff that I never knew existed, but I would like to think that perhaps in some way the Big O is at least like 0.2% more popular than it was when I first made my first video. I always wanted an in-depth analysis of it, and when I couldn't find one at the time of me publishing the original version of this, I decided to make my own so that I could take an in-depth look into one of the best obscure animes of all time. Now, of course, back in the day, or back in those times, my production, editing, everything was not as good as it is now, so I've always wanted to remake this series, but due to the extent of which it would need to be remade, this wasn't as simple as just slapping together the Ergo Proxy playlist with a few neat transitions into a singular video. I redid all the audio because I feel like that was the weakest part of the original thing, and of course some of the visuals are touched up, and the writing in general has been streamlined as well. And I want to thank everyone for helping me along the way by just, watching my stuff and motivating me to continue perfecting my craft. I really do appreciate that, especially considering how small the channel is. Now, getting to a few loose ends about the actual retrospective, there was a few other characters which I thought I could look into but decided not to. There's Gordon Rosewater, who does represent a unique perspective on the desire to forget the past and a desire to negotiate, a repentant soul who simply wants to live out his last days in peace, but I feel like he didn't have enough screen presence to really validate being looked at, and he's more of a plot device than a character. Then there's Beck, the thief with the suit, who same thing, not that much character and more important for plot stuff. And there's Vera, who is the extreme manifestation of this. It doesn't really have any depth at all, just kind of there for plot stuff. I didn't really talk about any of these three characters in their own segments because they all kind of just serve more as a set-piece storyteller, and they don't really have that much depth. As for the themes of the Big O, I feel like even the ones I've come up with here do overlap a little, and they're kind of an amalgamation of a bunch of other smaller video ideas I had. Themes that I thought about including on their own were something like making a future or achieving balance. However, those would overlap so much with what's already in here, they would be redundant, so I just cut those segments. And finally, I'm still pondering a video about the production process of the Big O in detail, but that would require a lot of research materials that I don't currently have access to, and in addition, I'd like to keep making videos on all the other stuff that's on the backlog. Also, maybe the Big O manga one day, which I learned was a thing when I was redoing this script. As for the Big O itself, the Big O is a masterpiece of anime, and it's a lost work of art that, while anchored in a world obsessed with the past, also tells of the need to march into the future. It combines giant robot fights with subtle themes into a story which not only endears us to its action, but also its excellent characters and tender moments. In a timeless blend of style and substance, the Big O displays to us the importance of not only being the best version of ourselves, but establishing that person in the first place. It is a really one-of-a-kind work of art, and all of it teaches us about endurance and resilience, from that of the character's saving Paradigm to the show itself somehow pulling off an excellent ending twice, even though it was essentially cancelled twice. Roger Smith and R. Dorothy Wainwright should rightfully go down in the pantheon of great early 2000s anime characters, as they, and the cast around them, make for such a beautiful and unique piece, defined by how out of the way it goes to be different. And while being different isn't necessarily a good or bad thing on a surface level, the Big O does so on such a meta level. It feels intentional, and it meshes beautifully with themes of life going on and the need to establish yourself regardless of the past or the future. The Big O is a beautiful dissection of the creative process, in fact, as even if it was kind of a commercial failure, it never really took off in any of its various forms, it's still beautiful and can prove that art still has meaning regardless of whether or not it is super popular. The series as a whole was a sort of failed attempt at a massive multimedia property, with the hope that the little bits that made it through to completion would still be successful. And while they may not have been super successful, they're still beautiful and inspiring us, showing that art doesn't need to be well known to be art. That's why the Big O inspired me to create this channel in the first place, because even if it doesn't really take off, I still enjoy talking about these pieces, and it's still very nice to be able to express my feelings on things like this, and the Big O proved to me that even if this channel's not successful, it's still a good use of my time. Getting back to the series though, from its unique ending to its beloved characters, to its amazing soundtrack, and its one-of-a-kind noir art style, the Big O is a masterpiece all of its own, and that's why I love it. And that's why I cannot express how grateful I am to all who have listened to me fawn over such great obscure anime memories. Such memories not only of this excellent piece, but of all the others I've looked at over the years, and all the others I hope to look at someday. I just want to say that I'm still very happy with this channel, and I'm still happy that I get to fawn over such amazing art and express such love for it in a world which often likes to focus on the negative of many things. It's great to just try and tackle positive themes and characters and shows like this in ways they truly deserve. Even with this remake of the retrospective, I still haven't done the series justice and stress that you have to watch it yourself to get the full picture. But I would like to think that I've taken a good crack at trying to elaborate, at least on a small level, why the Big O is my favorite anime of all time. And even if the number of people on this channel or joining this or watching this channel still isn't the biggest, I'm still very pleased and honored to have you listen to me fawn over such great, obscure anime memories.